Let me take you back to the 1940s, a time when the world felt both heavy and hopeful, with swing tunes filling the air and families making do on what they had. We'll wander through the simple days at home, the music that got folks dancing, the way we stretched our rations during the war, and those quiet nights with typewriters tapping out letters far away. It's all just memories of everyday life, the kind that stick with you for their warmth and steadiness. I remember those mornings in the 1940s when the house was still wrapped in that soft gray light before the sun climbed high, and I'd make my way down to the kitchen in my stocking feet, the wooden floors cool under me after a night of fitful sleep with the war news weighing on my mind from the evening before, and there on the stove I'd set the old percolator, the one with the glass knob on top, that let you watch the coffee bubble up dark and strong, filling the air with that rich, earthy smell that promised a fresh start no matter how heavy the day ahead might turn out to be. It was a simple thing, really, just water and grounds scooped from the can with that metal scoop, poured in careful so it wouldn't overflow and make a mess on the stove that we'd have to wipe up later. And then I'd light the burner with a match struck quick against the box, watching the blue flame flicker to life under the pot, steady and reliable like the routines we clung to back then when everything else felt so uncertain with the rationing and the letters coming from boys overseas. The percolator would start its work slowly at first, a gentle perking sound like distant rain on a tin roof, building to that steady chug-chug as the water heated and rose through the tube, carrying the coffee essence up and over, dripping back down darker each time until the whole thing was brewing just right, and I'd stand there leaning against the counter, arms crossed, letting my thoughts wander to the day's chores, or maybe to how my father used to do the same thing years before the war. Changed everything, his hands steady on the handle as he poured it out for the family, teaching me, without words, that a good cup could steady your nerves for whatever came next. That smell would spread through the house then, waking the others gently, my wife stirring in the bedroom upstairs, and the kids mumbling from their rooms, drawn down by the promise of warmth in their bellies before they headed off to school, or I to the factory. And it was in those moments that the kitchen became the heart of our home, a place where we gathered without rush, sipping from those thick ceramic mugs that held the heat just long enough, black for me, because sugar was too precious to spare on mornings like that, though sometimes on Sundays we'd stretch a teaspoon around the table if we had it, making it last like a little treat amid the shortages. I can still feel the steam rising to my face as I lifted the mug, the bitterness on my tongue cutting through the last fog of sleep, and we'd talk softly there over the table, not about the big worries like the headlines screaming from Europe or the Pacific, but about small things, like whether the garden needed weeding after breakfast, or if the neighbor's boy had come home safe from his last leave. Conversations that knit us closer without ever saying it outright, because in the 1940s, with the world pulling families apart in so many ways, those morning coffees were our anchor, a ritual that said we were still here, still together, facing it all one day at a time. And as the pot emptied, I'd rinse it out quick in the sink, the grounds swirling down the drain like worries we set aside for later, readying for the next meal, because life didn't pause for the percolator to cool, it just kept perking along, much like we did, finding comfort in the familiar amid the ration books and blackout shades that defined those years. There was a peace to it, you know, in knowing that no matter the broadcasts later in the day bringing word of battles or victories, this one act started us right, with the house smelling of home and the day unfolding steady before us. A quiet strength brewed in every cup that carried us through until evening when we'd do it all again. After the coffee had perked its way through the morning quiet, and we'd all gathered around the kitchen table with mugs steaming in our hands, it was time to set out breakfast proper, the kind of meal that came together simple and quick from what the ration books allowed us in those 1940s days when every scrap counted toward making the week stretch without going hungry, and I'd reach for the bread loaf on the counter, the one baked fresh the day before from flour we'd saved stamps for at the store down the block, slicing it thick with the serrated knife that pulled just right through the crust without crumbling it too much, because we couldn't afford waste when the war had turned even basics into treasures to be doled out careful and fair. The butter dish sat there in the center, that small pat wrapped in wax paper from the last dairy delivery, yellow and firm from sitting overnight in the icebox, and we'd pass it around the table one by one, my wife first cutting a thin shaving with the edge of her knife, spreading it slow across her slice so it melted just enough to soak in without pooling. The flavor rich and creamy on the tongue despite the skimpy amount. A reminder of how the cows back on the farms were pulling double duty for the troops overseas, leaving us civilians to make do with what filtered through the lines after the quotas were met. I can still picture the kids' faces lighting up as they took their turns, eyes wide at the sight of that golden smear on the plain white bread, because butter wasn't something to take lightly back then, not like the spreads we hear about now, but a treat earned through the stamps clipped from the book that hung by a string on the pantry door, red for meats and blue for fats. Each one punched out by the grocer's machine with a satisfying thud that meant we'd planned ahead and hadn't overspent. The family share. We'd eat it there in the morning light filtering through the checkered curtains, the toast crunching soft under our teeth as the butter softened the bite, washing it down with more coffee or maybe a glass of milk if the delivery boy had come early enough that week, and the talk would flow easy around those bites. Nothing heavy like the front page stories, but practical things, like how many points the sugar ration would cover for the weekend's baking, or whether the neighbor across the way had traded eggs for extra flour again. Conversations that wove the family tighter without fanfare, because in the midst of blackout drills and bond drives, this breakfast table was our steady ground, a place where the rationing didn't feel like punishment, but like a shared puzzle we solved together, turning limits into something almost like abundance through the care we put into every portion. Sometimes the butter was a bit off from the weight at the creamery, carrying that faint tang from traveling miles in the heat, but we didn't mind, scraping it generous anyway, because flavor was flavor, and it paired so well. With the homemade jam we'd put up last summer from the victorygarden's berries, a spoonful dabbed on the side to stretch the richness further, the tart sweetness cutting through the saltiness in a way that made the whole slice sing on the palate, and I'd watch my son butter his bread with those small hands, mimicking my motions precise so as not to waste a drop, learning without lecture that thrift wasn't about going without, but about making what you had go the distance, a lesson that stuck deeper than any schoolbook could teach amid the air of uncertainty that hung over the decade. The plate would clear slow, crumbs brushed into palms and saved for the chickens if we kept a few out back, or just swept away gentle, because cleanliness kept the spirits up too, and as we finished, the satisfaction settled in like the warmth from the stove still lingering in the air, a full belly from so little signaling that we'd start the day right, fortified against the factory whistles or school bells. Waiting outside, because that rationed butter on toast wasn't just food. It was proof of our resilience, a daily act of defiance against the shortages by finding joy in the ordinary. The way it bound us in quiet gratitude as the house came alive with the sounds of coats grabbed and lunch pails packed, carrying that simple nourishment forward into the hours ahead, where life demanded we keep going steady and strong. And looking back, those breakfasts taught us more than we knew at the time, showing how even in the tightest squeezes of the war years, a shared meal could mend the frayed edges of worry, leaving us ready to face the ration lines or the news broadcasts with heads held a bit higher, the taste of that butter lingering as a small, unspoken victory in the rhythm of our home front mornings. With the breakfast plates cleared away and the last crumbs swept from the tablecloth that my wife had starched just the week before using the flat iron on the stove, I'd step over to the sink in our 1940s kitchen where the window overlooked the backyard fence line, the one whitewashed every spring to keep things looking neat despite the war's pull on paint and supplies, and turn on the faucet with that familiar creak of the handle, letting the water run hot from the boiler we'd jury-rigged in. The basement to save on gas during the shortages, steam rising gentle as it filled the basin deep enough to dunk the whole stack of dishes without splashing over the edge onto the linoleum floor that we'd mopped the night before to chase away the day's dust tracked in from the streets. The soap bar sat there on the dish, a plain yellow chunk from the ration allotment that lathered sparse, but true when I rubbed it between my wet hands, bubbles forming soft and few compared to the foamy piles we'd known before the war turned even laundry suds into something to measure out careful, and I'd start with the glasses first, swirling the water around their rims to rinse away the coffee rings left from our morning mugs, the liquid swirling clear as I set them upside down on the drying rack that unfolded from the wall, like a faithful old friend always ready for the task. Because in those days washing up wasn't hurried work, but a steady rhythm that followed the meal like the tide after a wave. giving space for thoughts to settle while my hands moved through the warm suds that soothed the calluses from factory shifts or garden digging the evening prior. The plates came next, stacked greasy from the butter pats and toast crumbs, and I'd scrub them gentle with the sponge we'd made from a loofah traded at the block party last fall. The bristles rough enough to lift the residue, without scratching the china patterns that had come through my mother's line, patterns of blue willow trees and bridges that told stories of quieter times before ration books dictated what filled our cupboards, water sluicing over each one as I rinsed under the cooler tap to set the soap free, the clink of porcelain against the rack building a quiet music that blended with the distant hum of the neighbor's radio, tuning into the farm report, a sound that made the chore feel less like duty and more like part of the home's heartbeat, connecting the breakfast we'd just shared to the hours stretching out ahead where school runs or work whistles would call us from this peaceful bubble. Forks and knives followed, the silverware we'd polished monthly to keep the tarnish at bay with a paste of baking soda and vinegar when the real stuff ran short, sliding them through the soapy water one by one, feeling the tines catch lightly on my fingers as I worked the grease from between them, memories flickering of how my father taught me to handle the blades careful so they stayed sharp for carving the rare Sunday roasts. And in that sink-side moment with suds up to my elbows, the warmth seeped into my skin like a balm against the morning chill still clinging to the house, allowing my mind to wander without pressure to places like the victorygarden plot where beans were poking through the soil or the letter I'd post later to my brother in the service, words forming easy in the quiet as the last fork rinsed clean and joined its mates on the towel for drying. Pots from the coffee percolator and the saucepan of oatmeal we'd stretched with extra water to feed the growing kids took longer, their sides crusted stubborn from the heat, requiring a bit more elbow grease with the soap worked into a lather that clung just enough to cut through, my arms moving in circles steady and unhurried, because rushing only led to chips or slips in those old sinks with their porcelain chips from years of use. And as the water drained away with a gurgle down the pipe that sometimes backed up if the grease trap filled too quick, I'd wipe the counter with a damp rag, leaving everything gleaming under the light from the single bulb overhead. The kitchen transformed back to order from the lively scatter of our meal, a small victory in itself that set the tone for facing the day's demands with a clear space to return to come evening. Those washing up times were more than cleanup. They were a bridge from full bellies to full days, a chance to let the steam clear my head of overnight worries about the war's shadow or the next coupon stamp due at the grocer, hands busy in a way that freed the rest of me to appreciate the simple fact of having dishes to wash at all, a sign that the family was fed and the home held together through the thrift we practiced without complaint. Because in the 1940s, when typewriters clacked late with news from afar and swing records waited for nightfall, this hand-washing ritual grounded us in the now, turning ordinary water and soap into threads that wove our resilience tighter, leaving the sink empty and the heart a little lighter as we moved on to whatever came next in the steady flow of home front life. Once the dishes were stacked to dry and the last drops of sudsy water had been wrung from the rag, I'd move over to that corner of the kitchen where the old wooden radio rested, its rounded top scuffed from years of restless hands turning the dials, and I'd run my fingers over the smooth surface, feeling the warmth left from the tubes inside that never seemed to go cold even on the chillest mornings. Tuning the kitchen radio was a ritual every bit as steady as breakfast or letter writing, linking our small kitchen to the distant world beyond the porch, and that dial, painted with cities like Cincinnati, Chicago, and New York, always spun just a little stiff, clicking softly until it landed on the familiar crackle of our local station, its announcer reading the morning news in a voice I came to trust like family. I'd set it low, not to disturb anyone still upstairs, and let the first thin chords of swing music or the muted headlines settle in under the background noise of birds starting up outside and traffic beginning to move out on Main Street. Sounds that blended together to remind you another day was stretching out, untouched, waiting to be filled. Most days, the radio was our only real line to the war, and the voice on the air would deliver weather reports, factory bulletins, and news from the front with a steady calm that felt almost soothing, even when the news itself wasn't good. There'd be moments when they'd announce letters home from local boys, or the first hints of victory gardens making the rounds along the neighborhood, little victories and losses woven into the morning like salt in the dough. And I'd stand there with my arms folded, listening for the names I might know, eyes wandering out the kitchen window to where our flag hung soft against the siding. Sometimes the broadcaster would pause for music next, and the house would fill with those bright notes, a Benny Goodman tune or an Andrews Sisters harmony rising up to cut through any gloom still lingering from night. Music that made you tap your foot without thinking, and for a while, even if you were anxious or tired, you'd remember how it felt to be lighthearted. Before ration books and telegrams changed the shape of the world, my wife would drift through with a towel in her hands, pausing just long enough to catch the news about flour prices or to listen for any mention of soldiers coming home. And though we rarely spoke during these moments, I could tell what weighed on her by the way she held her shoulders or glanced back toward the stairs, listening for footsteps. The children knew by instinct to wait until after the news before asking for anything extra, sensing this was serious grown-up time. And so the sounds of their quiet morning routines, pages rustling, shoelaces tying, became another layer in that kitchen chorus, each person finding their place in the rhythm set by the broadcaster's steady baritone. On rare good days, the station would take calls from folks all over the county, and I liked to imagine the voices coming through the static belonged to someone down the block, or maybe a cousin from towns over, sharing recipes for getting by with less sugar or stories of sons riding from far-off camps. The whole room held for a moment by the kindness and ingenuity of neighbors we'd never meet. When it was time for headlines, I'd stand close, tuning the knob again for the clearest sound, because every word mattered. Ration changes, scheduled drills, news of bombers built at the plant across town, and those few minutes often shaped the spirit with which we faced the day. Sometime after, a Johnny weather update or a snippet of sponsored advice would follow, and I'd jot mental notes about which coat to wear or whether to plant beans today or hold off for warmer weather. Always grateful for the little bits of certainty the radio offered in an uncertain world. That radio brought us together, not just with the rest of the country, but with each other too. It hugged every worry, every hope close. The kitchen growing quieter each day as the announcer closed with his usual, signing off until next time, leaving us to face the world better informed and just a shade less alone. Then I'd turn down the volume, the tubes glowing faint in the muted morning light, and step away with a heart steadied, reminded once more that no matter what news might come, there was something good and ordinary in sharing these moments, hand-cracked static and all, in the small but sturdy center of our lives. Once the kitchen settled after breakfast, and the radio's chatter faded into the gentle hush of a house in its morning stride, I'd reach for the daily paper left on the stoop, always a little damp at the corners if there'd been a heavy dew or a stray breeze from overnight rain, and set it out flat on the cleared kitchen table, careful not to let the spread pages catch a stray splash from the dishpan or a bit of toast crumb that hadn't yet found the floor. Holding the paper itself was a kind of small ritual, the newsprint smudging faintly on my palms as I separated the sections, the headlines about battles overseas, the sports pages with yesterday's box scores, the advertisements promising ration substitutes if you knew where to look, each one rustling in a way that brought a kind of calm, steadying me with the thought that no matter what uncertainty the world held, it always began with these same simple sheets delivered just past sunrise, familiar and true. Sometimes I'd slide a chair close and begin reading in quiet, not out loud, but in a way that let my mind wander between the lines, picking out bits of news like the price of eggs at the grocer down the street, or which neighbor had a son or brother marked in the honor roll of returning soldiers, their names bolded above the fold. I remember how my wife would sometimes pause, hands still wet from wiping down the counters, to ask what the paper said about the weather, concerned for the laundry she hoped to dry outside, or to see if the ration changes reflected in the government column might mean swapping out today's dinner plans for tomorrow's. The paper didn't soften the bad news, and every so often, a headline about a lost ship or another push across distant fields would quiet the whole room for a moment, but mostly, it told the story of us getting on, a collection of other families just like ours, making steady progress through worry and hope, side by side in print even if feet apart in daily life. I had a way of folding it, neat but not too polished. The front page first, creasing along the length so I could tuck it beside my coffee, then setting aside the funnies for the youngest in the house, who'd come in after a while, hair still tousled from sleep, drawn by the simple joy of colored cartoons and jokes that were never too clever, but always kindly. That simple act of choosing which part to save for folk, which story to mention at the mailboxes out front, made the daily news a shared thing, not just the burden of one man sifting through the world's troubles, but a comfort that ran through the hours ahead, something to revisit at dinner or across the backyard fence on a slow afternoon. Sometimes, if a story was worth holding on to, a notice about a neighbor's ration drive, or an announcement for a dance at the parish hall, I'd tear the strip clean with careful fingers and pin it beside the kitchen clock, so it wouldn't be lost in the shuffle of later chores, keeping those reminders, where everyone might glance and feel a little more connected to things outside our four walls. When the paper was read and the mug beside it empty but still warm at the handle, I'd stack the pages together, aligning the edges with a practiced "I so nothing" flapped loose, folding it twice so it fit just right on the shelf by the door, ready to be repurposed for peeling potatoes or lining a drawer later in the week. The leftover ink on my fingertips was as familiar as a handshake, a gentle reminder that I'd paused long enough to know a little more about the day and the world that kept spinning, for better or worse, whether or not we knew all its secrets. On Sundays, we'd gather up a week's worth and let the kids bundle them tight with twine for the paper drives, another small contribution to the war effort, and I'd watch the pride light up their faces as they lugged the pile up the block, eager to do their part. Reading and folding the morning paper was never just about following the news. It was about marking the rhythm of our mornings, passing along the bits we could use and releasing the rest, trusting the ordinary flow of daily life to do its work in shaping us bit by bit. It was a source of steady comfort all its own, the soft rustle and sharp crease of newsprint echoing the quiet resilience that uncannily defined those years. And looking back, I know we found in that gentle habit a way to keep on, aware, engaged, and quietly hopeful, as always, for whatever news tomorrow's paper might bring. There was something quiet and wonderful about those evenings when supper had faded into dishes and stories, and the dusk sat comfortably outside our window, while in the living room, I'd reach for the stack of records kept on a little shelf beneath the radio, my fingers tracing the worn sleeves that had been handled countless times. The Victrola stood like an old friend on its spindly legs in the corner, a little dust on the lid from a week's worth of life, but inside was a world all its own. A crackly gateway to music that made the worries of ration stamps and the faint echoes of war fade for a spell. Lifting the lid brought that familiar blend of wax and metal, the smell mixed with a hint of the wood polish my wife used whenever she gave the whole place a proper scrub, and I'd let the scene gather around me as I chose a Glenn Miller or an Artie Shaw, the kind of swing that was bright and lively, but still gentle enough to suit a house full of kids winding down from the day. Careful hands set the record on the platter, the black groove glinting in the lamp glow, and then came the needle, lowered with slow precision so it didn't click or pop too loud, a kind of reverence for the music that was about to fill the room. Then the magic began, the Victrola's arm gliding across, the faint hiss giving way to brass and saxophones, melodies lifting up and carrying us someplace lighter, someplace built for tapping feet and swaying hearts. I'd settle into my old armchair, letting the rhythm settle deep, feeling it roll through tired bones and loosen the knots left by the grind of work and worry. My wife might be folding laundry nearby, humming along without thinking, and sometimes the children would slide into the circle, their shadows long against the rug, eyes wide as the first lively notes spilled out, turning everyone's mood gentle and light. It didn't need to be fancy. We didn't dress up or put on airs, but it was special all the same. This time we carved out for joy amid the day's chores. Sometimes, after finishing homework, my son would take up a spot on the floor and try to match the horns with a makeshift trumpet built from cardboard and good intentions, puffing his cheeks and making us all laugh the way only a child can, even if the music was bigger than any one of us. My daughter would twirl, letting her skirt rise just so as the melody took hold, and her laughter would mix with the trumpet's swing, weaving a warmth through the house that lingered long after the record stopped. These records held more than tunes. They were stitched with memories, with dances from years before, moments of Sunday picnics or neighborhood socials, echoes of simpler days before war took center stage and asked everyone to do their part. Sometimes we'd play that same record twice, just to stretch the feeling out, and by the second round, I'd join the dance, clumsy steps, not like the jitterbug I'd managed as a young man, but the kind of movement that said, I'm here, I'm home, and this is good. The swing didn't wipe away every care, but it softened them, placing joy back in its rightful place beside us, steady and welcome. And when the record ended, sometimes with a gentle slowing and a scratch or two, I'd lift the arm and set the disc back in its paper sleeve, careful not to smudge, and look around at the faces glowing in the lamplight, seeing that music's gift was lasting not just in the notes, but in the ways it brought us together, seated side by side, living room walls holding the sound like a secret shared only by those who knew the worth of quiet happiness. As the night deepened, the Victrola would close with a soft click, and we'd linger for a while, talking low about the band or where we'd heard the song first, remembering moments passed with fondness, always grateful that, for all the uncertainty and shortfall the world could muster, a spin of the record could build peace and contentment out of little more than rhythm and wax. That's what those evenings gave us. A reminder, plain and true, that music was hope turned real, and the everyday act of spinning a record on the Victrola could carry a family's hearts quietly through even the hardest times. After supper had settled and the kitchen radio had kept us tethered to news and neighborly voices all day, the mood in the house would shift as evening fell and the real treat began. Tuning in to those big band broadcasts that came over the air, filling our little living room with the kind of music you could feel deep down in your bones. I remember the way everyone would slow down, even if there was chores left to be done, pausing by the doorway or leaning on a chair just to catch those first bars, brasses bursting in and drums keeping time, the notes threading through our home like the smell of my wife's bread fresh out of the oven. It was special, a gift bought not with ration stamps, but with attention, with the shared anticipation as we gathered close and listened for familiar favorites to spark up next. I'd adjust the knobs, searching for that sweet spot where the music came in clean and clear, maybe a bit of static rolling in from a distant thunderstorm or some factory's late-night shift, but when the sound was right, it was like the whole world got smaller, just our house, this broadcast, those musicians in faraway cities who never saw us, but somehow played for us just the same. The announcer, always polished and warm, would say a few words, then step aside as the band leader would count off, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the melody would pour out, bright and golden, the kind of music that asked nothing more than for you to listen and let your shoulders drop. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, those names were like daily company, and their music cut through fatigue and the nagging simmer of distant war, bringing joy that felt as ordinary as breathing. Some nights, my wife and I would move the table aside, letting the twins sit cross-legged on the rug while we took each other's hands, if only for a slow sway around the room. We weren't showy, no spinning or fancy steps, just a gentle rock back and forth that meant, I'm here, I love you, we'll get through whatever comes. The children watched, sometimes interrupting with giggles or asking about the band's name, but mostly they listened, their faces soft and still in the low lamplight, learning the comfort of rhythm and melody by osmosis, the way a cat curls up on a warm patch to soak in every ounce. Even the family dog, old and loyal, would find his spot under the table, tail tapping in lazy time with the beat as the house softened under the spell of bright brass and fast fiddles. I remember one broadcast night especially. Benny Goodman's clarinet soars into sing, 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 the tapping of my own foot matching the drum fill. And for a minute I could picture dance halls bursting with noisy hope, soldiers in uniform whirling partners with tomorrow set aside for just one night, laughter ringing off the rafters, all miles and worries forgotten. Our house wasn't a ballroom, but the music made you feel like life was bigger, like the walls held more than just worries traded across the day. My wife sang along, voice a little shy at first, then stronger with each chorus, her smile easy as the bandleader cracked his own jokes through the static, building a bridge between strangers and friends, musicians and folks just getting by in their living rooms. When the set ended, there was always a pause, the broadcaster thanking the band and signing off for the evening, sometimes reading notes sent in by families we'd never meet, birthdays, anniversaries, news of boys sent to the Pacific or coming home at last. We'd listen close, hearts warming or tightening in empathy, feeling part of a wide invisible web tied together by radio waves, swing notes, and the hope that tomorrow's news would be kinder. The music faded, the lamps flickered as bedtime crept in, and I'd sit for one quiet second before turning the dial to silence. Grateful that for all we'd given up that year, the evening's broadcast cost nothing but our open ears and the courage to find happiness when it came singing through the static. The house felt lighter, the worries faded just a notch, and sleep always came easier with those tunes lingering soft in memory, promising that tomorrow would hold new songs and, with luck, the same ordinary peace. Back in those long summer evenings when the light hung low and golden over the patchy grass beyond our kitchen door, you'd find us out back with the Victrola pulled up to the window, and the swing tunes pouring out as clear as we could coax them, busy trying to teach each other the jitterbug steps we'd seen in newsreels and heard described by cousins who'd written about the real dance halls in towns big enough for a Friday night crowd. There wasn't much to it at first, just a piece of old rug laid out over the dirt, reserved for the feet that wanted to try their luck at twisting and hopping right along with the brass and snares that skipped their rhythm through those sturdy little speakers. The music was our only teacher, and so we'd watch the eldest nearby, usually a neighbor who claimed he'd learned from a GI on furlough, and reckon our chances were as good as anyone if only we paid attention, moved with the beat, and didn't mind taking a spill or two. I remember the way laughter would fill the space before anybody even dared to step, the uncles faking a flourish and tipping imaginary hats, the aunts clapping in gentle time and calling out, "Left foot now, right foot now," half in jest but all in encouragement. The children lined up with serious faces, trying their best to copy the grown-ups' quick feet, each one sure they'd outdo their brothers and sisters if only they could get the spin without tumbling into the lilac bush or kicking up dust under the family dog's paws. And somewhere in all that, I'd find myself pulled in. First, just to tap a foot and offer advice. Then, before you knew it, joining hands with my wife or letting the youngest balance themselves on my shoulder as we all lurched into the bright, impossible beat. It wasn't graceful, though sometimes it came close by accident, and every miss was met with a round of good-natured ribbing, each lesson ending in a heap of laughter and grimy handshakes. The rug got dirtier with every session, the faces got brighter, and the bug bites lost any real importance, drowned out by the joy of making something new together. Sometimes the neighbors joined, drawn over by the music or the memory of younger days when they danced at high school socials or dime store celebrations before everything turned serious with the war and good news grew thin as the ration books in their coat pockets. They'd pass down steps learned by heart, slow and steady, correcting our form with gentle words and steady hands, never taking command, just passing along what good times used to mean. The men would show the way to hold a partner, even if the partner was only a broom, and the women would tip their heads, laugh, and lift their skirts just enough for the twirl, knowing that being together in the easy heat of dusk made each movement softer, each mistake part of the fun, nobody keeping score except for the rhythm that belonged to all of us. Evenings would roll into night before we realized how late it had gotten, the sun falling behind the fence while the last records played scratchy but proud. I recall how my eldest would manage the full step at last, a swing out, a twist, a hop back in, smooth enough to cheer, and suddenly everyone would try that bit, shouting advice or just yelling with delight at the attempt. Under the porch light we'd gather for water or lemonade, the faces damp with effort and the legs sore from dancing. But not one word of complaint slipped out, only plans for another round next week, promises to practice in secret, and stories told of jitterbug stars from far-off places, their magic stitched into our own slow patchwork of ordinary happiness. And the music lingered, trailing through the screen door as we gathered ourselves up, sweeping the rug free of sticks and shaking out our shoes for dirt. I'd watch the world hush and settle around us again, gratitude folding in soft, knowing that while the swing records might carry tales of wartime and city lights we'd never see, the lessons learned with laughter in our backyard were good as any. Just people sharing what they could, making light where they found it, building up courage and closeness one jitterbug step at a time, hoping the world carried on as simple and fair as an evening spent teaching each other the dance. When the night had grown quiet and the restless hush of the day's chores was behind us, there would come a moment where, instead of spinning another record or letting the radio drone on, we'd gather up the stack of old sheet music kept in a sturdy folder tucked away in the bookcase, its corners soft and some pages yellowed from years of late-night use and the dust of summers gone by. Those sheets were treasures handed down or traded at the corner shop, each one marked by the names of melodies everyone seemed to know by heart but wanted to see written down, maybe for a new verse, maybe for a harmony to try. I'd lay the sheets out across the living room table, smoothing them with gentle hands, careful, always, not to tear the fragile edges or lose track of the order, since it wasn't just paper, but memories set in ink, chunked out in neat bars and shaded notes that anyone could hum when the lamp burned steady and the mood was right. That lamplight was its own kind of magic, a simple bulb set in glass casting wide circles over the wood grain and letting the room feel both cozy and a touch grand, as if we had a stage all to ourselves. The children, sleepy but stubborn, would crowd in, fussing to find their favorite songs, and my wife might pick out "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree" or "In the Mood," humming through the first bars before we all joined. A harmony built not of trained voices, but of familiar ones, unpolished but true, winding through each stanza with a homespun kind of pride. I'd take a song myself sometimes, finding comfort in those lines, even if my voice cracked on the high notes or drifted a little flat for a chorus, knowing nobody much cared for perfection, because what counted was the warm togetherness and the chance to let music do for us what no broadcast or bandleader could: lift the spirits, bind up worries, steady the heart. It was a gentle ritual, someone calling out a number and flipping straight to it, old eyes squinting through thick glasses, young ones sprawling on the rug and learning the lyrics straight from the source. Occasionally, we'd encounter a mark or a scribble in the margin, my mother's hand, or my sister's note from last Christmas, reminders of evenings spent much the same in years before, the handwriting lit by that same lamp's golden glow. When we came to a song less familiar, there was patience in the air. Someone would tap out the notes on a battered piano set against the far wall, keys sticky from cold dust, and too many little hands, clumsy at first, but always finding the rhythm by the second verse, the tempo gathering strength as everyone joined in bit by bit, voices overlapping, sometimes laughing at the way a lyric twisted, or pausing for a sip of tea when things got too jumbled. Every so often, I'd look up and catch the way the lamplight painted shadows on the ceiling, making the whole place seem bigger, more connected, as if those notes and voices could travel beyond our four walls and bring a little comfort to anyone listening. I didn't think much of being a musician. Most of us were just trying for sincerity, but there was an art in how the songs shaped the evening, reminding us not just of happier times, but of the steady, gentle grace in each day we managed together, carrying tunes that had survived other hard years, other distant troubles. Sometimes, when the song was done, nobody said much at all. There'd just be a slow smile, a quiet passing around of pages for the next selection, the room growing softer and kinder, the distance between things like war or work or tight money shrinking to nothing under the steady sound of lived-in voices. In those lamplit moments, it mattered less who sang the best or who faltered on a tricky verse. What mattered was the closeness, the way a melody, handed from sheet to sheet, could fold a family together and cushion all the day's bruises with ordinary hope. We'd sing until the lamp burned lower or the youngest nodded off, tucking the sheets away once more in their folder, promising ourselves another round tomorrow or maybe on Sunday, when there'd be more time and fewer chores. Sometimes I'd keep one out, just to hum alone by the window after everyone else had gone to bed, the notes soft and full of memory, the music lingering in the quiet, reminding me that simple songs, shared and sung together, made the hardest times easier, turning any evening, lit only by a humble lamp and a worn stack of paper, into a lasting story of how we held on, with nothing but each other's voices for comfort. On Saturday nights in those 1940s years, after a week built of work and chores, ration book reckonings and news drifting in through cracks around the kitchen window, there came a bright spot that felt different from everything else: the trip to the dance hall. It was never grand, not like the clubs pictured in city papers or the ballrooms flashed on the newsreels before picture shows, but it had a way of making you forget the world outside for a few hours, lifting spirits much as any holiday. And you could see it on the faces of everyone gathering near the double doors, shoes shined and hair smoothed, hearts hoping for good music and small kindness just as much as a little fun. We'd walk into the building, hands full of pennies for tickets, clothes clean and pressed but plain, nodding hellos to neighbors and work pals. All folks you knew from the market or the trolley stop, now in their Saturday best, and ready for one night to pretend the world was lighter. The dance floor had a shine from care, boards sanded by hundreds of feet, always a little sticky in one corner and a bit uneven in the other. The walls hung with paper streamers faded from past celebrations, but still holding on through one gathering after another. The band, a mix of local men and one woman who played piano so strong her hands blurred at the fast songs, set up near the exit and tuned up. Horns, drums, the slight whine of a guitar, while folks trickled in, settling at the tables by the punch bowl or calling out last-minute arrangements for rides home. Each week brought new faces and familiar ones. Elderly couples moving slowly through the waltz, teenagers nervous in the corner, soldiers mixed in with their dates, just home on leave or leaving soon, taking in every minute as though to stretch it into memory for when the world turned rough again. The music always started with a slow tune, giving time to find partners and settle nerves, the room filling with voices over the gentle shuffle of shoes, the rhythm picking up as the songs rolled forward, weaving swing numbers and jitterbugs that sent folks reeling out across the boards. I recall catching my wife's hand, feeling the years slip away in the touch, swirling as best I could, careful with her shoes, and always mindful of her laugh when I misstepped, pride unhurt, because nobody came for perfection. They came for the feeling, the togetherness, the chance to let loose and put the weight down. Kids ran in circles outside where the music spilled through the open windows, imitating the grown-ups in their own unruly way, giggling and taking turns, hoping someday to be inside, caught up in the moment rather than watching from a distance. The punch, sweet and thin, was ladled out with care by someone's aunt or grandmother, the table set with cookies and cakes saved from the ration allowance, special not because they were fancy, but because someone had made them thinking of the group, sharing what little could be spared. As the night deepened, the songs grew bolder, swing hits that brought more folks onto the floor, twisting and hopping, sometimes just swaying with a partner. It wasn't unusual for a stranger to offer a dance, kindness shaped through music, and you could see, around the edges and in the laughter shared between steps, how badly everyone needed this escape, this brief chance to remember who they were outside the worries, to hold on to hope for tomorrow by living fully tonight. There were times when a band member called out someone's name for a special tune or let someone sing along on the microphone, shy voices gaining confidence bit by bit, stitched together by applause and encouragement, the place blooming with connection. The final numbers always came too soon, a slow dance, then one last burst of brightness that sent the room shaking with applause, shoes scuffed and legs tired but hearts revived, aches forgotten for another day. Folks gathered their coats, exchanged last words, bundled up and spilled back into the night, the still air of the block holding onto the residual joy, the laughter and tunes echoing among the parked cars as friends and families made their way home, lighter and closer for all the hours spent spinning under the close watch of the band and the kindly kitchen clock. Those dance hall Saturdays shaped the stories of our town, gave comfort that lasted far longer than any single song. And as we walked back through the silence, hand in hand under the porch light, there was a peace and contentment that lingered and carried forward, proof that in hard years, joy is found in simple gatherings, music, and the courage to step out together and move, if only for a little while, as though nothing but happiness existed outside those walls. It's hard now to picture just how much of life, day in and day out, revolved around those little ration books sitting in a kitchen drawer or tucked behind a sugar bowl on the windowsill in the early 1940s, the kind of thing you kept within arm's reach because you never knew when you'd be making a trip to the grocer or the butcher, and nobody, certainly not me, could grasp what a slip of colored paper meant until you'd lived with it a while. The book itself was flimsy, gray and blue and red, each page filled with tiny rectangles marked with codes and numbers that told the world, in no uncertain terms, what and how much you'd be allowed to have through the month and into the next. They said everyone had to do their part, and so everyone learned the meaning of make it last, not as some motto on the wall, but as a fact you lived and breathed, counted, and sometimes worried over well into the night. Grocery shopping turned from easy routine to a task that asked for planning, patience, and a bit of strategy. You couldn't just walk in and pick out everything you wanted. Instead, before stepping out, my wife and I would sit at the table after supper, the ration book open flat, talking quietly about what we had left, enough for coffee if we scraped, a ration for sugar, but not enough for extra baking, and always keeping back a few for the children's milk, because that, they said, was most important. Saturday morning brought the familiar routine, collecting the stamps we'd need, holding them tight in the palm of my hand so none went missing, pocketing the book, and heading out into the bit of chill no matter the season. At the store, there was a kind of hush in the line, everyone taking measure of the week's options. The clerk sat behind the counter, scissors ready and a stamp pad close. I'd hand over the careful selection, blue for processed foods, red for meats and fats, each color telling its own story of shortages, supply, and sometimes luck. The thick black stamp would punch into the coupon with a dull thud, and that was that. No going back once it was done, no arguing for just one more serving, not unless you were willing to trade with someone else after the fact. Sometimes in line, a neighbor would whisper they'd swap eggs for coffee or had extra lard to offer if you had spare sugar points. These quiet deals were never greedy. They felt more like neighbors looking out for one another, a way to make the shortages less sharp. I remember how, back at home, every use of a coupon was an event marked and sometimes mourned a little. We'd keep the empty coupon books, too, lined up in a kitchen drawer along with the stray buttons and pen refills, because, in some strange way, they told the story of how we managed, month by month, what we had and what we went without. For the children, there was a lesson in those stamps that couldn't be found in any schoolbook. That gratitude rose up not from having plenty, but from learning the taste of enough. My eldest would watch me count the slips, sometimes practicing her sums as I figured out what could be stretched for supper, and I know that knowledge, of careful planning, of sharing rather than hoarding, stuck with her more than any arithmetic worksheet. There'd be good weeks and lean ones depending on what came through at the delivery trucks, but we learned how to make every ounce stretch, watering stews, saving bacon grease in a tin near the stove, baking when we could and turning to dried beans when we could not. We'd talk to folks in line at the store, share recipes for substitute ingredients, sometimes laugh at disasters turned not so bad, with a dash of hope and salt. And on rare occasions when something extra came, an orange from a relative down south, a can of peaches from a soldier returning home, it felt like celebration shared right down to the last bite, because nobody in a small town let a blessing like that pass unnoticed. Those ration coupons marked time in a way clocks never did. They shaped what we cooked, how we gathered at the table, what stories we passed along about making do and getting by. I can picture the books now, a little tattered at the edges, faded by use, each one a patch in the quilt of those years, each one proof of small victories as we made it through together, finding ways to stamp our days with gratitude and stubborn cheerfulness amid a world that kept asking more of us than we ever expected. Out back, past the laundry line and the creaky wooden gate, was the patch of earth that came to mean more to our family than nearly any corner of the house. A victory garden planted not only for the sake of fresh food, but for hope and a kind of purpose that ran deeper than the grocery lists and ration coupons that ruled the kitchen. It started simple enough. A few rows marked off in the early spring, spaded with care on weekends when the factory shifts allowed a full morning under weak sun, the dirt cold and stubborn at first, but loosening with each pass of the shovel and the encouragement of neighbors who'd already placed seeds in their own backyard plots. My youngest helped carry water from the spigot, sloshing over his boots and making a mud mess of the path, but nobody minded, laughter mixing with the patient instruction as we pressed peas and beans into the furrows, fingers rough from work, but gentle as could be for this homegrown effort. Those first months required a careful watching, late frosts nipping at the leaves, birds swooping in for stray kernels, and all of us learning quickly that growing a proper garden meant something more than scattering seed and hoping for the best. Each morning before breakfast I'd walk outside, coffee in hand, eyeing the progress and coaxing a little strength into drooping stems, sometimes muttering encouragement, sometimes muttering about the squirrels. As the weeks rolled on, the rows took shape till they were almost straight, and we set out stakes from odd bits of wood and reused string. Nothing fancy, just the things we had on hand. My wife read up on companion planting, pairing marigolds with tomatoes and letting squash run wild in the far corner. Sometimes a neighbor down the way would wander over, swapping advice about which manure was best or bringing cuttings from her own garden tucked behind the fence. By midsummer, the patch looked nothing like those magazine pictures hidden in a drawer. Perfect, lush with endless produce. But in the sunlight it was its own kind of beautiful. Lettuce heads, beans, and carrots poked through in all stages, some thriving, some struggling, all looking like hard-won proof that patience could indeed feed a family a little better, stretch out the rationing, and build pride in doing what needed to be done. The children, suspicious of vegetables in ordinary times, grew attached to the things they helped plant, running in from play to show off the largest bean or the gnarled carrot with its trailing roots, faces shining with a sense of accomplishment that seemed bigger than just what fit in a stew pot. My wife would rinse tomatoes at the well, shaking them dry with practiced hands, sometimes holding one up and smiling, saying, "This'll be good for supper." When the first real harvest landed, baskets full if not overflowing, we picked together, sunburnt, grinning, grateful for every tomato, every pea. The kitchen filled with the scent of real food, enough to supplement what the store couldn't always provide, and I felt something quiet settle in, the dignity of growing what we needed, of passing those skills on without much ceremony, just through the doing. Some evenings I'd help shell beans until my palms went green, telling stories about the farms I'd known as a boy, connecting the past to the present with every tiny pod popped open and each bowl set aside for freezing. We saved some seeds for the next spring, careful not to use them all, knowing that the cycle would continue whatever the world tried to interrupt. Canning afternoons became family affairs. Glass jars clinked on the counter, filled with pickles and beet slices, rows of vibrant summer color waiting to feed us through cold months or be tucked aside for sharing with neighbors in need, those who'd had a poor growing season or whose ration book came up short. And every time I looked out the window as the sun sank behind the fence, the garden half in shadow, half glowing, I felt the day's burdens lift just a notch, aware that this patch of earth knit us not only to good food but to good sense, resilience, and a pride that came quietly but strongly and stayed. The garden didn't solve everything. Some years were dry, and some years bugs ran wild, but mostly, it gave us more than vegetables. It gave my family a place to be together, working, wondering, laughing at the odd-shaped produce and the missteps, learning that what we grew with our own hands mattered in ways the ration stamps couldn't account for. In those times, a handful of beans or a bowl of tomatoes from the Victory Garden was less about plenty and more about enough, a true measure of doing for ourselves even as the world asked more and more from everyone. One of the ways you measured the spirit of the neighborhood back in those wartime days was by the sound of old metals clanking together, the calls across the street, and the steady footprints pounding the sidewalks whenever it came time for a scrap drive. If you lived through it, you remember how sudden the word would go out. Maybe an announcement on the kitchen radio, maybe a sign in the market's window. And like clockwork, families all up and down the block would begin hauling out anything made of metal that wasn't being used or could be spared. Pots with dents, bits of window frames, broken bicycles, and every sort of stray thing that might possibly help with the war effort would appear, lined along the curbsides in little piles or packed tight into rattling wagons borrowed from next door. Every drive felt a little like a holiday, at least for the children, who made a game out of hunting through basements and garages for treasure. Neighbors swapped stories as they sorted. Remember when this wash tub belonged to Maud's mother? Or that was the old pedal car Johnny outgrew years ago. Each item coming with its own scrap of history before being handed over for something larger than ourselves. And there was pride, too, when the tally grew. This block, this family, contributing a few pounds more than last time, hoping it would be enough to help build planes or ships or tank parts far beyond anything we'd ever see. For the grown-ups, it was more bittersweet, letting go of objects tied tightly to memory or usefulness, knowing in your heart they might never come back, but trusting always that they were bound for better things. The trucks arrived early on drive days, flatbeds rumbling down the street at sunup, local men riding the back, calling out greetings, tallying what each house had piled up. We'd stand near our gate, hands on hips, watching the young ones scramble to help, everyone eager for the truck to stop at their house, feeling the pride as their scrap got loaded up and the men in overalls offered a cheery "Thank you, folks. Every bit helps." You could see the sense of unity swelling with every metal pile passed hand to hand, gaze to gaze, the community weaving itself together around the effort. The block's worth wasn't measured in money those days, but in how metal was stacked and how chores fell second to doing the work that would mean something in the larger world. Sometimes there was a contest, who could bring the most, who found the oldest relic or hauled out something nobody expected. A rusty bed frame might get a cheer from passing neighbors. The children made up stories about their finds, turning scrap into imaginary swords or shields before finally giving them up for the good of the cause, learning along the way how giving up something now could mean safety for someone later. My wife and I would gather around our pile after the trucks left, chatting with the Hendersons from next door about what might be needed for the next drive, sharing coffee and relief that our part was done until the call came around again. As the day wound down, the block would look cleared out, almost bare, as if everyone had swept out the last remnants of old times and old worries. But the feeling was camaraderie, knowing that the pots and pans no longer sitting under the sink, the iron rails no longer propped by the door, were out in the world doing good somewhere, helping build what we needed to keep moving forward, to protect those whose names we'd read aloud after supper or whose faces we saw in folded photographs tucked in wallets. In ways big and small, these scrap drives taught everyone, young and old, about collective action, about how neighborhoods could band together for something much bigger than themselves. It didn't matter if your pile was large or small. What mattered was showing up, handing over what you could, and doing it alongside the faces you knew from everyday life. Looking back, I realized those scrap metal drives were more than about war materials. They shaped our sense of belonging and duty, filling ordinary days with the hope that what left our hands might someday protect those we cared for most. And in the end, that was worth every lost saucepan or bent fork we sent rattling away down the road. The sound of those trucks rolling on, metal piled high, waving neighbors sending off another collection, still echoes like assurance, an anthem of togetherness that belonged to the block as surely as any shared meal or lasting friendship ever did. Most nights, once supper was cleared, the radios turned down and the children settled into homework or stories by lamplight. My wife would fetch her knitting basket from beside the old rocking chair and set to work on socks for the boys overseas, a ritual as steady and heartfelt as any part of our home front evenings during those war years. The basket itself had its own history, a gift from her mother before the war began, bound up in memories of cheerful afternoons long gone, and inside it a tangle of yarn, needles, half-finished pairs waiting for their match. There was a devotion in those hands, practiced movements making light of a task that required both patience and quiet persistence, the rhythm of looping and pulling, sliding the needles together until the house itself seemed to hum in time with the steady click, click, click beneath lamplight. She'd measure every strand, using up odds and ends gathered from shop returns, church drives, sometimes trading with neighbors who had extra wool or colors better suited to warmth. Sometimes she'd read the letters that came tucked inside parcels from the local Red Cross, stories from far-off places, requests for sturdy socks to withstand cold barracks or long days on muddy roads. Those notes weren't dramatic or pleading, just honest, appreciative, simple, written by hands as tired and hopeful as ours, hands that gripped rifles and pens with the same longing for comfort and connection. The first row was always meticulous, counted out, a project begun with full attention, sometimes in silence, sometimes accompanied by low conversation about the news, ration updates, or the day's small victories. I'd watch the pattern take life, a heel rounded, a toe gathered, each stitch built as much from love and worry as from fiber, each mistake gently unpicked and redone, because good socks mean fewer cold toes, she'd say with a smile that never fell away even during the late hours. Our eldest learned alongside her, hands smaller but no less determined, giggling when her loops went astray, asking if her socks would reach as far as France. More often than not, the answer was yes, And that knowledge wove pride into the work, a sense of belonging to something larger than just the living room where we sat. As the weeks went by, the socks were bundled tight, tagged with humble directions, and packed for shipment by the local sewing circle. Each contribution marked with the first name of who made it, sometimes with a note for luck or a picture drawn by one of the little ones. A small bit of home sent across the miles, and, hopefully, received with a smile and a quiet thank you. My wife never counted her output. Not really. She measured her success in the care given and the knowledge it brought some warmth to a stranger with a connection not easily described in words. It was unspoken solidarity, a kind of mutual comfort for the many who waited for letters and news, for safe returns and peace. There was something gentle and remarkable about seeing those socks pile up next to the basket, gray and brown, stripes as available, practical rather than fancy, built for hard use, but carrying softness, too. The work wasn't about accolades or recognition. It was about doing what was necessary, making the gaps between letters and homecomings feel a little shorter. Late at night, sometimes her eyes heavy and the house gone quiet, she'd finish one last toe, not the end, and set it aside for morning packing, sighing softly with the satisfaction of another job well done. Knitting socks for soldiers made the war feel nearer, more personal and real, yet it also allowed for some hopefulness, something built and sent from one caring soul to another. Those socks became, in their way, symbols of diligence and quiet love, physical proof that even the smallest acts at home mattered somewhere far away, carried by the tides of conflict and care. Looking back, I see how, night after night, that slow, careful knitting stitched together our hopes and fears, our longing for safety and reunion, forming a thread that held our family steady, and maybe held some other weary souls just as firmly, warmed by a kindness that traveled farther than we could ever know. There was a kind of solemnity to those trips to the local bank when we went to buy war bonds, an act that felt more serious than anything else we might have done in a week's time, marked by a sense of duty and hope that ran right alongside the usual concerns of paying bills and stretching the grocery money. The brick building stood sturdy on the corner, gold letters shining over the doorway, as if the place itself wanted you to remember the old ways of saving and security. Stepping inside on a Saturday morning, past the worn tile and the echo of footsteps bouncing off high ceilings, I'd joined the small line that wound its way toward the teller's window, faces familiar as family, men from the plant, mothers from the school association, juniors with crisp envelopes clutched tight, everyone standing ready to lend what they could toward a cause nobody could see, but everyone could feel. We didn't dress up for bond buying, not really, but there was always an air of respect, shirts tucked in, hair combed, hands wiped clean after a quick breakfast at home. I'd carry the envelope with a few dollars set aside from the week's wages, sometimes with coins wrapped in paper if times were tight, always thinking about the value of that sacrifice and how it might add up with those from neighbors near and far. The clerk behind the glass looked every bit the part, steady, polite, a sort of anchor in the swirl of uncertainty, and he'd greet each customer with a nod and a smile, careful to explain what each bond meant, the terms, the papers soon to be handed over. Sometimes a poster hung nearby, red, white, and blue, a soldier saluting, words about doing your part blazoned across the top. I remember the feeling as the teller clipped the certificate and slid it across the counter, numbers and signatures lined up, the texture of the paper rough under the palm. A real, tangible promise that what left my pocket wouldn't just be lost, but returned in the form of better days, safer nights, maybe even a bright future for the children all of us had sent off to school that morning. We'd chatter quietly in line as bonds went out, folks sharing news about who'd enlisted, who'd sent word from overseas, or just swapping stories about old times and changing fortunes. There was no pressure, but there was camaraderie, a sense that even in small acts, you stood shoulder to shoulder with your neighbors, all trying to keep hope alive, all believing in the value of everyday sacrifice for the greater good. Young ones learned the importance of these bonds, too, entrusted with spare coins to buy a stamp instead of a full certificate, marveling at the bright colors and neat rows their growing collections made. The bank tellers always made a fuss over the children, praising their effort, assuring them that every nickel counted, all the while parents watched, some with pride, some with quiet concern for how long the war would stretch and how many more bonds they'd scrimp together down the road. But every transaction ended with something more than a piece of paper. It ended with the kind of handshake and quiet assurance that spoke louder than any advertisement or speech could, a shared conviction running through the room and out onto the block. The bonds found their way home, tucked safe in a drawer next to the ration book and the family photographs, a visible testament to faith and perseverance. And as the years moved on, the stack grew, sometimes slowly, but always with intent, marking the passage of seasons and sacrifices big and small. My wife and I would count them up each spring, talking about what the return might mean: a new pair of shoes for the oldest, a chance at a college fund, simply a little cushion for when the world finally righted itself. The bonds were more than an investment. They were a lifeline strung from house to house, neighbor to neighbor, binding us together in optimism and stubborn belief that our pennies and prayers might tip the scales toward peace. Looking back, I realize how much buying a bond at the bank was about more than money. It was about putting hope on paper, finding comfort in unity, and casting your small vote for a better future in a time when uncertainty filled the air. Each certificate handed out was a marker of trust, in the country, in the fight, and most of all, in each other. Even now, that quiet morning in the bank, faces lined up, coins passed forward, smiles exchanged over the promise, remains a memory shining as clearly as those bold letters above the door. We believed together, one bond at a time. As the long days slipped into twilight and the last of the evening chores were done, there'd be a sudden shift in the house, a change in the air, a hush that fell steady as dusk itself, because nightfall in those years could never be just nightfall. Every so often, you'd hear the call go up and down the block, maybe a sharp whistle from the warden or a rap on the door from a neighbor letting folks know it was time. The blackout drill was about to begin. We all took it seriously, even if nerves twitched a little in the quiet, because everyone understood it wasn't make-believe. This was the world's way of reminding us all, young and old, that war didn't stop just because the sun went down. Pulling the blackout curtains was always the first step, thick cloth that we'd stitched by hand and tacked up with care beneath the window frames, heavier than anything we'd bothered with in peacetime, meant to seal every scrap of light inside so not a single glow would leak out and betray our street to eyes above. My wife and I swept quickly through the house, making sure every lamp was out, every curtain pulled tight, blankets thrown over ceilings leaks if we spotted them. The children, at first scared but later brisk with practice, hustled around, snapping off radios, checking the edges, sometimes squabbling in nervous whispers about who was letting a line of light escape from beneath the door. Then we'd settle into the dark living room, resting on the couch or the floor, speaking in low voices that seemed to bounce against the walls, softer and slower than usual, as if even noise ought to be rationed, kept safe from the night air that pressed outside. At times you could hear the neighbors through the walls, the creak of stairs, a cough, the soft mumble of reassurance, reminding you that everyone nearby was going through the drill together. Every small house linked by the understanding that caution was as communal as bread or borrowed sugar. There was a peculiar intimacy to those hushed evenings, faces just visible by window light, stories told in half-whispers, little ones resting heads on laps, questions held back or answered gently. What are we hiding from? Will we have to do it again tomorrow? And the answer, always honest but never frightening, was yes, because that's what folks everywhere were doing, and we were just one dot on a long, watchful chain. Sometimes, after the house had quieted and my eyes adjusted, I'd look out through the edge of the curtain, heart thumping a little, seeing the block in total darkness, no porch lights or kitchen glows, just empty silhouettes in the moon's thin glow. In those moments, I felt the strain, the keen knowledge that all our daily hoping and planting and working could be swept aside by a danger bigger than any one person, one family, one town. But I also felt the strength. Houses lined up together in obedience and faith, everyone playing their part, keeping each other safe as best they knew how. When the all-clear came, a faint whistle, maybe, or just the sense that enough time had passed, I'd open the curtains slow, letting the darkness out, the room feeling strange and freshly vulnerable for a moment, as if the world had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. The children hurried to relight lamps. My wife started tea for comfort, and conversation returned, voices rising with relief. Maybe we'd laugh about bumping into chairs in the dark or how the quiet made the crickets outside sound too loud. But below that ran a current of gratitude, the relief that we had lights to turn on, a house to shelter us, and the knowledge that, at least for tonight, everything remained as it should be. Looking back, those blackout drills pressed a cautious patience into us, a nightly discipline that taught the value of vigilance, of doing hard things not just for ourselves, but for everyone. It was a strange ritual, sometimes nerve-wracking, sometimes just a mild inconvenience, but it wove us all together in the dark. And, in its own way, it strengthened the ties between neighbors and family, proving that even in deep uncertainty, you could face anxiety side by side and emerge, however quietly, into another ordinary night. Much as I think of the home front and the rituals that held a family together, another rhythm marked those years in the 1940s, the steady, insistent call of the factory whistle at the break of dawn. My day started long before most folks' first cup of coffee, slipping from a warm bed into boots set by the door, careful not to wake the children still tucked under patched quilts. The house was cool and hushed before sunrise. Shadows stretched long in the hallway as I made my way to the kitchen for that first quick drink from the percolator, strong, hot, meant to kick my bones awake for a full shift's work ahead. Outside, the neighborhood shimmered with a sleepy silence just before the world kicked into gear. The only sounds were the shuffle of other men's feet heading the same direction down the sidewalk, collars up against the morning chill, lunch pails swinging by their sides. My factory sat at the edge of town, red brick, big windows always smudged with weeks of dust, chimneys pouring out a gray haze you could spot in every direction. Lines of workers, men like me, and, as the years rolled on, plenty of women, too, filed under the metal arch where a board guard gave each of us a nod or checked our passes, stamping our time cards with a quick thunk that sent us along to our stations, another cog in that massive, humming machine. Inside, the factory breathed its own kind of life, gears turning, belts whirring, announcers' voices barking from a single battered speaker overhead, reminders about quotas, updates on the war, a bit of big band music now and then to break up the drone. I worked at an assembly bench, metal pieces clattering as I bolted them into place for hours on end, the job changing by week depending on what was most needed. Sometimes airplane parts, sometimes machinery for convoys, always something headed far from home, but built with the same steady care. It was hard work, heavy, repetitive, exacting on the hands and tiring in a way that seeped into your bones, but the kind that let you feel you were doing your part, even if you never saw the end result except in the newsreels at the theater on weekends. Breaks came and went, marked by a shrill bell, sometimes just long enough to stretch your back and scribble a note about errands for home, or jot down your next hours in that small notebook we all kept for tracking pay. I'd sit with the same handful of men, trading quiet words over sandwiches, the talk always circling back to ration stamps and the latest news from the front, or maybe rumors about folks moving up the line. By lunch, the sun was up and hot through the glass, sweat beading under my collar, machines never slowing for anything but the unexpected jolt of a breakdown. Then a flurry of wrenches, mutters, and hands working together, all of us knowing that every lost minute counted. Women worked alongside us now, rosy posters all over the lunchroom, and some of the best folks on the line were the ones who'd come out of homes and classrooms to lend their effort where it mattered most. There was pride in that, too, seeing neighbors and wives and sisters covered in factory dust, faces set in determination, all of us learning new skills and settling into routines we'd never imagined a few years earlier. When the whistle blew for quitting time, bodies sagged with fatigue, but spirits perked up, boots shuffling over concrete, the sun setting in streaks of color behind the factory as we spilled back out onto the street, tired but proud. Shifts rotated, folks coming and going around the clock, a cycle that kept the machinery of both factory and town spinning, day after day, season after season, through every uncertainty. Looking back, I remember the weight of those hours and the quiet camaraderie around every workbench, the sense that no matter how small our own piece seemed, it fit into something bigger, something lasting. The whistle's echo carried me home to another evening of stories, supper, and blackout drills, but for a few brief morning hours, the factory was its own world, honest, demanding, and, more than anything, necessary. We gave it the best we had, day after day, knowing the world we built might never see our faces, but would always carry some measure of our effort forward. It's easy nowadays to walk past old murals and faded newspaper clippings without giving much heed, but back in the 1940s, those Rosie the Riveter posters were everywhere, bright and bold and full of determined faces, a rallying cry tucked behind every shop window, pinned to corkboards at union halls, taped on the doors of the local grocery, and hung right in the break room at the factory where I worked. "We can do it," the posters shouted, the iconic woman with a red bandana and a rolled-up sleeve looking out from beneath her brows, as if daring anyone to challenge the notion that women weren't cut out for hard work or hard circumstance. The image became so common and so potent that its message seeped into our daily fits and starts. Conversations between shifts, laughter at lunch, pinning a fresh copy above the drinking fountain as new faces came on board. To see it take hold right before our eyes was something rare and powerful. My sister, for instance, found herself signing up at the employment office on a brisk spring morning, dressed neat and hair tucked back under her scarf, asking simply where she could lend a hand. Before the war, she'd spent her days at home, sewing and minding her little ones, but the call came for all available hands. And soon enough she was learning to weld alongside men who'd spent decades in coveralls and heavy boots. The expression on her face changed over those first weeks, not out of pride, but out of the satisfaction that came with real work, with knowing you'd made a difference, however small. The posters told her, and thousands more, that every turn of a wrench, every bolt tightened, counted for something much bigger than herself. It put steel in her spine and a new rhythm to her step. Inside the factory, the shift was clear. There were more women at the benches and workstations with each passing month, learning machines and maneuvers as quickly and capably as anyone. The old hands soon gave up their skepticism and, instead, handed down tips and tricks the way you'd share stories at a picnic table. Rosie's face was everywhere in that building, a quiet supervisor reminding everyone not to quit when the work got tough. After a while, nobody pointed or laughed when a woman took her place on the assembly line. Instead, you saw pride, a steady respect growing for folk who rose to the challenge without complaint. Those posters did more than decorate the walls. They rewrote the rules about what was possible and who belonged. Outside, the message sank deeper. Wives who'd never set foot in a factory studying repair manuals by lamplight, daughters putting aside frills for utility, mothers gathering at sewing circles not just for socks and blankets, but for parts, uniforms, and safety gear. The town felt different. Even the men knew it, nodding with gratitude and a touch of awe at how seamlessly their wives, sisters, and friends took to tasks once reserved for men. The posters kept it all moving, a reminder that wartime effort wasn't exclusive to soldiers abroad. Every rivet, every stenciled message meant someone at home worked an extra hour, learned a new craft, and stretched her limits right alongside the seasoned hands. When I walked home in the evenings, factory dust clinging beneath my collar, I often stopped a moment to look at those posters in the windows. They weren't just tokens. They were hopeful signs that we could change our fate with persistence and mutual care. My family talked over supper about the new normal, my wife recounting how Mrs. Carter had become forewoman at the mill, how even the children now looked at Rosie and saw their mothers in her eyes. More than once I heard my youngest say, "If she can do it, so can you," pointing at the poster with a grin. And I'd smile, because by then, we were all a bit changed, not just the women who'd stepped forward, but the men who'd learned to welcome their strength. Even now, that rosy face means more than slogans or wartime nostalgia. It symbolizes a strength we learned together by sharing burdens, taking on new roles, and trusting that effort counted for everything. The posters faded as the years rolled by, corners curling, colors dimming, but their power lived in every woman who rose to the challenge, in every community that embraced the shift. Rosie's message stuck. We can do it. And we did, side by side. By the time midday rolled around, the steady thunder of machinery and the haze of oil and dust would have seeped deep into our clothes and skin, and the clang of the noon bell was more welcome than any song on the radio. We'd turn off our stations, wipe our hands on rough cotton rags or the thighs of our trousers, and make our way in ones and twos to whatever patch of shade or warmth we could find. Sometimes a drafty corner in winter, other times the edge of a sunny loading dock when the weather was kind. Pulling the lunch pail from under the workbench was another small, ordinary moment that meant more than it seemed. The simple pleasure of sitting with familiar faces and the comfort of something packed at home. Opening up the lid, I'd nearly always find a sandwich. Sometimes bologna with a curl of lettuce if ration stamps had stretched far enough. Sometimes just a slice of cheese or leftover roast tucked between two pieces of bread heartier than anything from the bakery, made with whatever flour my wife could spare. There was never much fuss about it. No condiments, no frills, just enough to get a man through another 4 hours on his feet. If times were tougher, you might see a chopped egg spread thin, with a bit of salt pocketed in wax paper, hard biscuits saved back from Sunday, or, on lucky days, a wedge of apple or carrot, packed in with a silent hope it'd keep well until midday. My wife always tucked a note or a small handkerchief in when she could, something to remind me that home and warmth waited for me after the shift. There was a ritual to the break, more than just the food. We'd eat together, men and women, sometimes in groups separated by old friendships or shared jobs, but more and more as equals, joined by the same need for rest and camaraderie. Talk circulated in low, steady rumbles. What we'd heard on the morning radio, news from the front, rumors about coming layoffs or overtime schedules, how the crops looked out past the edge of town. Laughter, too, but nothing boisterous, just the kind that passed from hand to hand, carrying itself across the food and the fatigue with a gentle ease. The women who worked alongside us, some with their hair still pinned up tight under scarves, others shaking dust from their sleeves, brought lunches just the same. Half a sandwich, a couple of crackers, sometimes a thermos of soup if the morning had allowed. You learned quickly not to judge another's meal. Everyone did their best, and trading a cookie for a piece of fruit or sharing another's last pickle was more about kindness and community than about filling your stomach. There was quiet pride in those meals, too, a sense that getting by, day after day, and not letting it break your spirit was a triumph worth savoring, even if it came wrapped in wax paper. Sometimes, if a supervisor wandered by, the talk died down and folks hurried to finish, but more often, there was an easy trust among us during those short minutes. Time stood still for just a little while, the worries about quotas and missing supplies fading under the balm of ordinary conversation and shared bread. On somber days, when word arrived about someone lost or gone overseas, we'd eat in silence, nodding to the space left at the end of the row, honoring it with respect that said more than words ever could. And always, the bell came too soon, calling us back to the lines, pails snapped shut and hands brushed clean. But I left those breaks with more than a belly half full. I left them with the sense that, in a strange and comforting way, the world was made smaller and kinder by each meal eaten together, every sandwich shared out of both need and simple decency. Those lunch breaks taught all of us a quiet resilience. That strength is built not just in the hands that work, but in the moments where folks come together, share what little they have, and face whatever hours remain, side by side and steadfast, until the bell rang again and sent us forward, shoulder to shoulder, through another afternoon. When the work at the factory was through and supper had ended, there were times I'd settle in at my desk by the window with the street lamp casting its steady yellow glow over the neat stack of papers waiting beside my old typewriter. That machine was a fixture in our house, black and heavy, its keys worn smooth by years of letters, ledgers, and the simple correspondence that kept life ticking along. Most nights, I'd press its keys quietly while my wife knitted in her chair and the children finished homework or drifted to sleep, the click-clack echoing through the otherwise calm of the house. In those days, a typewriter was more than office equipment. It was a lifeline for earning a bit extra, doing reports for the plant manager, helping neighbors draft letters home or complete forms for the ration board. My fingers knew the feel without watching. The bump of the home row, the indentation on certain letters tapped so often I could guess the key by touch. There was discipline to it, an order and clarity in the way the words formed one after another across the page. I'd draw a breath, roll the paper in straight, and begin, sometimes recording the results of a week's production, sometimes drafting a thank you for a borrowed tool or a reply to someone needing directions for a war bond form. It was solitary, satisfying work, demanding my attention and rewarding me with tidy stacks of finished pages, each measuring some small accomplishment in the flow of those busy, uncertain weeks. The typewriter's sound became a signal to my family. The children learned not to interrupt unless it was urgent, my wife humming softly as she worked so as not to distract me. There was comfort in the routine, the steady rhythm offering a kind of peace, even as the world outside remained unpredictable and charged with anxiety. Sometimes, after the numbers were done, I'd shift to more personal letters, notes to my brother in uniform, stories to distant cousins, updates on the family garden, or news from our small town. These letters required more than mere typing. They needed honesty, warmth, a voice that came through in the choice of words and the way each line landed true, not flowery or forced. Errors happened often enough, fingers slipping on the keys or mixing updates on reports. When they did, I'd pull the sheet out, crumple it gently, and start again, knowing that persistence, even in small things, was its own kind of practice for everything else we faced. The bell at the end of each line became familiar, marking progress through the work, carrying me forward page by page until I'd reached the night's end or a good stopping point. Sometimes I'd look up, rub the fatigue from my eyes, and catch the street outside quiet and empty save for a distant headlight's flicker, feeling both the isolation and the connection built by simple words sent abroad. Neighbors would call now and then, asking for help with forms or to borrow the typewriter for a night. I never said no, understanding that community, in those strange days, meant sharing the tools you had, whether for a work letter, a plea for supplies, or a message to someone waiting for good news. Each request stitched us tighter to the block, and every finished letter or report was one more sign that routines, however plain, meant something. We weren't just filling out papers. We were building records, keeping trust, holding the world together one page at a time. Before bed, I'd gather the pages and set them aside to dry, the ink smudging a bit if I hurried. The last lines always landed quietly, whether they spoke of numbers, gratitude, or longing. The typewriter stood silent as the lamp clicked off, its keys resting until the next evening's work, and I'd close the window against the chill, set the pile of reports or letters by the door, and head to bed with the feeling that, at least for tonight, I'd helped hold our small corner of life steady. Looking back, the typewriter clacking in the quiet wasn't just noise. It was an anchor, a habit, a place to set worry down and write hope, plain and real, for whoever needed it. Each morning before the sun had really claimed the sky, I'd pull on my coat, tighten the scarf around my neck for those months when the air nipped sharp, and make my way down the familiar blocks to the streetcar stop, lunch pail in hand and boots echoing quiet over sidewalks still slick from dew or, in winter, coated with a skim of frost. The streetcar was more than just a way to get from home to the factory or office. It was a lifeline, a moving slice of the community that gathered folk from every walk for the start and end of their working day. And you could tell time itself by the clatter of its wheels arriving at the corner, never late. Always a minute or two early if the wind was with the driver. There'd always be a handful of folks already at the little shelter when I arrived, bundled up in the layered fashion of folk who planned to stand still a while. Men in overcoats reading their papers or gazing at the line of houses whose lights flickered on as each new person woke. Women with shopping baskets or children in tow. Teenagers with sleep still clinging to their eyes, but as much a part of the morning landscape as the brickwork around us. Sometimes, you exchanged a nod or quiet greeting, trading small observations about the weather, supply news, the state of last night's game if the mood was light, or sinking into shared silence that was companionable, never awkward. The streetcar itself was all chipped paint and worn benches, but it felt like home the minute you climbed aboard. The little heaters hissing to take off the chill, the conductor's cheerful step lively, urging a decent pace even for those with tired limbs or arms full of parcels. The windows swooped foggy with everyone's breath, framing scenes of the city waking up, storefronts being swept, owners turning over their open signs, milk trucks making the last of their rounds. No matter how tough or worrying life got elsewhere, the city outside kept its own dependable rhythm on these trips. Inside, the trip offered a kind of steadying pause, familiar faces day after day, occasional newcomers, all of us bound by the same collective shuffle toward work and duty. Folks would catch snippets of conversation from seats behind them, sometimes share a recipe or tell a joke, other times just watch the world roll by, counting stops and tracing with a finger the condensation on the window pane. There was a sense of order and structure to each ride, a comfort in knowing the exact swing of the car around the sharp turn by Jefferson Avenue, the little jolt as it pulled to a stop near the sweet-smelling bakery, the bright laugh of a child 2 rows back. Nobody needed much, just room enough to sit and a corner of peace to gather your thoughts before the day's clamor began. Some spent the ride reading the paper, folded once and then again to hide headlines of war and loss that stung too sharp if left in view. Others watched the faces, catching glimpses of stories in a glance, a pressed mouth or a hopeful smile, seeing the same fatigue and resilience mirrored back each morning. Sometimes the conductor would call out news, a new store opening, a fundraiser at the church, a notice for families worried about ration changes or blackout times. It was a ripple of information passed along almost tenderly, a reminder that even when the world felt too big, the streetcar itself had its own kind of small-town heart. When the factory gates came into sight, most of us would stretch a bit, pack away the crumbs of our breakfast, and ready ourselves for a full shift. The conductor made sure everyone got off safe, offering his best wishes as we stepped into the next piece of the day, shoulders a little squarer for having shared the journey. In the evenings, the ride home was quieter, filled with tired bones, but always marked by the small gestures. Someone giving up a seat for an elder, someone else sharing half a sandwich or the punchline to a joke that made the city feel, for a moment, like a much easier place. Looking back, the streetcar rides weren't just about travel. They were small lessons in community, patience, and gratitude. Each ride was a chance to begin again, side by side, rooted in the details of daily life, steadied by the routine. For all the challenges and changes that swept through those years, the sound of the conductor's call and the jostle of the streetcar still echo warmly, a memory of movement, company, and the steady reassurance of an ordinary trip across town. After the supper dishes were stacked and the kitchen grown quiet, but for the hum of conversation, our living room would fill up with warm lamplight and the expectant faces of family ready for our favorite bit of radio. And almost every week, it was Fibber McGee's closet that drew us together in laughter, no matter what else the day had held. The radio sat tall on a corner table, its wooden sides polished by my wife every Saturday morning, knobs easy to turn, dials marked clear for the handful of stations we could catch in our part of town. Every time the show came on, the whole room leaned in, eyes wide as if waiting for a friend to walk through the door and bring some cheer. It started like any radio drama, but the voices were familiar, free of pretense, with the gentle teasing and good-natured ribbing that belonged to real-life families just as much as the fictional ones on air. Fibber and Molly sounded like people you'd know, a couple a bit older, always running into some small trouble, meeting neighbors who managed to find a way to be a part of the calamity or the solution, depending on the need. Their house seemed half like ours, muddled and ordinary. The heart of it, that legendary closet, a running joke that never got old, no matter how many times it happened. We knew when the moment was coming. The way Fibber's voice would get a touch brighter, Molly cautioning, "Don't open that closet, dear." And then the door would creak, and out would crash every pot, pan, tennis racket, and old boot you could imagine, the sound effects rattling through the speaker so real you could almost see the dust cloud hanging in the air. The laughter was real in our home, my wife giggling, the children roaring, me shaking my head at the sheer chaos. Sometimes, one of the kids would try to recreate the mess with the broom closet in the hall, hoping to set off an avalanche for comic effect. And even when it was only a handful of shoes in the dustpan, it was good for another round of laughter. There was comfort in that routine, the certainty that, wherever you were, a bit of confusion and mess could be met with humor and kindness. Fibber and Molly handled every crash with sharp wit or soft wisdom, never cruel or biting, but always gentle, a sort of lesson for every listener on getting by with what you had, taking trouble in stride, and keeping close those who made life brighter by their presence. The show didn't dwell on the war, though sometimes there were references, jokes about ration books or scrap drives, but the heart of it was always lighter fare, silliness, clever lines, and the pleasure of shared stories. After the closet bit ended, The rest of the program rolled along, a parade of small-town character voices whose troubles could be fixed, laughs that came easy, and occasional musical numbers that added to the sense of togetherness. The entire family listened, rarely interrupting, sometimes passing a bowl of popcorn, sometimes just sitting hand in hand, letting the rhythm of ordinary joy fill the room. Once in a while, I'd glance at the faces around me, reminded of how powerful simple happiness can be, especially in years when heaviness lingered outside our front door. When the show wrapped, Molly's gentle voice and Fibber's final one-liners still hung in the room. Conversation started up again, lighthearted and easy, and sometimes one of the younger children tried out a joke or story they'd picked up from the program, hoping for a laugh of their own. And it worked, because laughter, just like good radio, was something folks gave generously back then, knowing it helped mend the rough bits and bind us closer, night by night, closet by closet. Looking back, Fibber McGee's closet wasn't just a running joke. It was a tradition, a link to joy and comfort, and the reminder that, sometimes, the clatter and confusion in your own house could be made better with a bit of humor and the company of those who cared. Those nights, gathered around the radio, I knew we were part of something larger. A community held together by laughter, stories, and the steady gifts of ordinary good times, crafted from the smallest and silliest of moments. On Saturday afternoons, when the work week had finally tapered off and the morning chores were finished, there was a special kind of anticipation that settled over our house. A promise of escape and wonder that only the local movie theater could deliver in those war-shadowed days. The theater was a sturdy old building at the center of town, its marquee letters changed by hand, always a little askew and blinking uncertainly in the faint daylight. But to us, that place meant adventure and fun, a chance to come together in the dim and forget, if only for a couple of hours, about the world's worries outside. We'd clean up quick after lunch, comb our hair, put on clothes just nice enough to make the outing feel special, and walk the few blocks with the children skipping ahead, their excitement carrying all the way down Main Street. I'd fish the coins out of my pocket, spare change saved bit by bit throughout the week, and pay for tickets with a handshake and a thank you at the booth, nodding to friends and neighbors gathering for the same spectacle. The theater doors swung open wide, swallowing us into a swirling crowd, folk drawn from every corner, all ages, settling into red velvet seats creaky from years of stories, elbows rubbing in the shared comfort of close company. Inside, the place smelled of popcorn, the kind popping in big metal tubs right by the lobby, a smell so inviting we almost always allowed ourselves a bag, extra butter if the ration points allowed. The children called out guesses about the upcoming features, trading predictions, and recounting plots of last week's Western or musical. At the front of the theater, the big curtain hung heavy in gold, its folds hiding the flickering promise of what was to come. The lights dimmed, hush settling over the crowd, and as the projector whirred to life, all eyes locked forward, the outside world briefly slipping away. The pictures themselves were magic, a double feature, nearly always, sometimes a cartoon to start everyone laughing, then a main event, cowboys fighting for justice, cities twinkling with jazz and possibility, sometimes newsreels with grainy images of faraway battles or speeches. Heroes flashed across the screen, their triumphs and stumblings so much bigger than anything we'd faced alone. When the hero won or the lovers danced beneath the moonlight, the whole place would ripple with sighs, laughter, applause. Even the grown-ups joined in, letting go, if only for a minute, of the strain and effort that marked so much of everyday living. During the breaks between reels, folks stretched and chatted, swapping candy or stories, nudging neighbors to share gossip or compare notes on good recipes and supply runs. The film itself became almost secondary to the act of gathering together, an unspoken agreement that such afternoons, fleeting as they were, would be cherished and remembered. The children lived for these matinees, imitating screen stars on the walk home, trying out lines from comedy shorts at supper time, retelling the entire adventures over and over in backyard games. The youngest sometimes fell asleep by the final curtain, nestled beside a sibling or parent, lulled by the steady hum of voices and the comfort of so many hearts beating untroubled in the dark. The matinee was affordable, close, and welcoming to all, a luxury in common reach even as ration books dictated so much else. For me, they offered a place to sit back, breathe easy, and watch the faces of my family glow in the silver light. Thinking how much those hours meant, how much they gave in laughter, hope, and the confirmation that ordinary joys were worth holding on to. When the final credits rolled and the curtain fell, we always lingered a bit, reluctant to let go, before picking up our things and stepping back into a world made gentler by the spell of shared stories. Looking back, those Saturday afternoons remain bright and vivid, a tapestry of ordinary happiness woven from celluloid dreams, nearby voices, and the enduring kindness found in a packed house, all hoping for something good and safe. That old theater was no palace, but in the soft hush of its flickering dark, it became a sanctuary where troubles were set aside and life shone a little warmer, story by story, picture by picture. Most afternoons, when the rush of daily work drifted down and chores found a brief pause, the radio came alive again, but in a quieter way, soft voices spilling from the little speaker with stories full of drama and longing, everyday troubles dressed up in gentle humor and hard-won hope. My mother had her favorites, of course, settling herself at the kitchen table with the ironing basket nearby, a stack of shirts and pillowcases waiting for the careful hand and a keen ear. I'd hear her tune in, turning the dial slow until the broadcast arrived, its familiar intro playing over the hush of the house, announcing another episode of lives unfolding in some small town not altogether different from our own. The programs ran the gamut, stories of doctors and teachers, shopkeepers and young couples, all facing twists and turns that seemed big for 15 minutes, but never edged too close to real disaster. My mother appreciated how these tales didn't shy away from truth or difficulty, but just as often, they found light in the kindness between neighbors, the steady force of hope and forgiveness woven into every crisis. It wasn't high art or fancy. It was simple comfort, the sort that settled nerves and filled the air with voices that sounded like someone you'd know, someone who might just knock on your door for a borrowed cup of flour. Sometimes I'd linger near the doorway, watching her iron shirts in time with the plot, the steam rising, her face brightening or creasing with each twist or turn. She'd mumble her agreement with a wise character, chuckle at a bit of gentle mischief, or sigh along with a tender reconciliation after a spat. The best episodes, she'd say, were the ones where folks made it right by the end. Arguments cooled over coffee, misunderstandings patched up before the closing music. My sisters gathered in, too, each with a bit of sewing or mending, all lending quiet company to the ritual, their hands busy but their attention rapt from the first minute to the last. Neighbors sometimes dropped by just then, bringing pie or asking after a borrowed book, and would stay for a stretch, drawn in by the warmth and the soothing predictability that came with the radio's steady hum. There was no shame in listening, either. In fact, after the program ended, conversation would skip naturally to the plot, comparisons made to the real world beyond the window. So-and-so at the market who'd had a similar trouble, or a clever fix for garden weeds learned from a fictional groundskeeper. The stories blended effortlessly into our own, each one a small reminder of the rhythms and connections that kept a family, a street, or a town moving forward. The children, if they were around, played at their own dramas in the next room, acting out secret weddings or mistaken identities with the cast of dolls and wooden blocks. Often, they'd wander in just in time to catch the final lines, asking, "Did everyone end happy?" My mother would smile, pat a shoulder, and offer an answer gentle and true. "Most always, dear. That's the way things should be." And the radio would hum again with the next show, breaking up the hush with another unfolding chapter. For me, soap operas in the afternoon were a touchstone, a way everyday anxieties found gentler answers, how ordinary people could believe things would turn out all right by supper. I learned a lot at that table, not just about ironing or mending, but about patience, the strength of forgiveness, and how simple storytelling could lift burdens with nothing more than words, voices, and a bit of music at the end. Looking back, those broadcasts carried more than tales. They carried real comfort, and a sense that, whatever troubles brewed, the day could end with hope, family gathered, and a kitchen full of light. The world outside paused just long enough for life to feel gentle and safe, one story at a time. Every time we went to the movie theater on a Saturday or for a rare night out, we knew we'd get more than just the promise of screen adventures or a bit of laughter from a comedy short. The newsreel always came first, rolling out truth before the escape, setting the tone for what happiness would mean on the other side of the curtain. I remember the hush that filled the room as the lights dimmed a first time for the newsreel, every voice quiet, and every heart attentive while the projector hummed and flickered, throwing grainy black and white images up on the big screen that felt somehow closer and more urgent than any story could. The newsreels were a window to a world we carried in our minds but seldom saw playing. A parade through wartime headlines and home front efforts, spotlights on ships departing for distant seas, crowds cheering for soldiers marching through city streets, glimpses of leaders speaking from podiums, each word measured and heavy as the audience listened. Clips sped through the victories and the losses, the everyday heroics at home, women welding at factories, children planting gardens, everyone working under the banner of sacrifice and hope. Sometimes there'd be a series about the latest inventions, radar, tanks, aircraft flying in formation as the narrator, voice strong and clear, explained their importance to the fight. These pictures gave us context, filling the silence around daily routines with purpose, showing that our own efforts, small as they might be, mattered somewhere along the line, and that ordinary resilience, gathering scrap, buying bonds, tending kids, was woven into the wider world's struggles and advances. What I remember most was the feeling in the room, an unspoken unity, the sense that all of us, gathered for fun, were bound together in hope and worry, watching the same scenes and wishing for safe returns and better days. When a local name or face appeared on screen, a mention of a nearby regiment or a familiar photo among the story of a medal won, whispers darted between rows, hands patted shoulders, and pride mingled with anxiety. Once in a while, the newsreel would linger on scenes of devastation, ruins in distant cities or families huddled in shelters, and though tears never spilled outright, you felt a sober edge in the dark, the heavy truth that what happened out there could, by chance or deed, touch everyone. After the toughest reels, the cartoon or comedy that followed brought more than giggles. It was like a deep breath, a chance to mend spirits and remember why laughter had its place even when the world was strained. Folks looked to those news segments for guidance, for a measure of hope or a glance at reality that sometimes felt too big to grasp on a kitchen radio or in the local paper. The children asked questions, nudging elbows and whispering about tanks, uniforms, flags, and sometimes politicians whose words sounded less like speeches and more like promises to hold on to. The elders offered quiet explanations, keeping worry at bay, turning each headline into another reminder of everyday heroics, both small and grand. When the house lights flickered up for the main feature, the tension eased, voices rising again, snacks passed across rows and eyes brightening in anticipation of adventure and escape. But the newsreel lingered as a gentle nudge to cherish what was good and familiar: home, laughter, the comfort of family, knowing that somewhere far off, others did the same under more difficult skies. Looking back, those moments in the dark theater brought the world home, joining us in shared hope and concern, knitting a community out of glances, whispers, and simple truths broadcast in flickering light. It's a memory that shines on. How the movie always started with the real, and how we gathered, somber and grateful, under a single roof, drawn together by stories that were ours and everyone's, just as much part of the evening as the popcorn and the laughter to follow. Evenings in our house found a quiet kind of peace after the stories had played out and laughter died down. And while the radio had its place, there was something altogether softer and more personal about spinning a record, especially when the voice rising from the grooves belonged to Bing Crosby. My wife kept the records organized in a tidy stack in the sideboard, sleeves carefully mended to keep out dust, and often after the supper plates were cleared and the last pot scrubbed, she'd ask me or the eldest to choose something gentle to round off the day, something with a bit of longing or hope in the melody. Bing's records were always first to hand. That mellow baritone seemed to settle right into the bones of the house, a sound that smoothed all the day's rough edges. White Christmas, Swinging on a Star, I'll Be Seeing You, each one familiar, yet able to sneak up and move you no matter how many times you'd heard it before. I'd put the record on, steady the needle, and let the first notes rise, soft as dawn, and somehow brighter for all they were understated. Sometimes we'd stack a few discs, let Bing's voice float out over bowls to dry or heads bowed together over schoolwork, his words a thread stitching the whole crowd in closer as evening wrapped around us. Those songs never felt strictly like entertainment, they were balm. They carried a kind of promise in their warmth, that things could get better, that distance might not last forever, and that a voice sent out into the world could find its way home again. My wife would hum along as she folded laundry, the children would quiet to listen, and I'd lean back, eyes closed just a moment, letting the music take the place of all the news and headlines, the ration stamps and blackouts. What I remember most is how ordinary moments, simple, even mundane, took on a glow when Bing sang. Sweeping up crumbs, straightening a bookshelf, mending a frayed cuff. Every chore seemed lighter, every shadow less heavy when melodies of hope spun through the room. When "I'll Be Seeing You" played, we'd sometimes pause, catching each other's eye with a silent agreement. It would all be all right. We'd see each other through whatever came. If a letter had arrived from a relative at the front or a friend returned on leave, we'd replay "White Christmas" twice, letting ourselves believe, if only for a few minutes, in those gentle winter memories built on a promise and a song. When guests joined for the evening tea, we'd always put on Bing, knowing the music would soften conversation, bring a smile, smooth over the hurts or the small awkwardness that sometimes came from news too sharp or stories from outside. Even folks who pretended not to care much for crooning would end up whistling as they bundled up for the walk home. Neighbors borrowing a cup of sugar would linger by the door, the familiar voice keeping them from rushing back into the dark. Music like that did more than entertain, it steadied people. It taught the children about tenderness, about looking for the hope in things, just as it reminded the grown-ups that, while we couldn't change the world with a song, we could certainly change a night and maybe, over time, the very feel of a home built, not just from bricks, but from ordinary faith and gentle truth. We didn't own much, but when Bing Crosby crooned in that living room, we felt like we'd been given something fine and lasting, a memory to tuck beside the ration book, a warmth to match the lamp's steady glow. Some nights, after the last record spun out to silence, the house would rest easier and the dreams that followed promised peace, stitched together with the music that made even hard times feel not quite so lonely after all. When I look back on the school days of those war years, I see a single wooden building set just a little apart from the rest of the houses. A squat, sun-faded place with coat hooks lined along the entryway, and a bell rope worn smooth by the hands of children and teachers alike. It was a true one-room schoolhouse in every sense, standing firm against the sweep of wind and snow in winter, catching the first heat of the sun in spring. Kids of all ages poured in together, boots lined up along the wall, lunch pails stacked in the corner, the scent of chalk and linseed oil filling the morning air. Nobody cared much for looks, not with rationed fabrics and hems let out season after season. The real pride was in showing up each day, books under arm and a heart ready to take on what the teacher set before us. Our teacher, Mrs. Ramsey, was steady as they came. Hair always pinned, voice clear but kind, a ruler ready for discipline, but used most often to point out signs or trace a line beneath a tricky word. She'd call roll with the same patience for the youngest learning their letters as for the oldest struggling with fractions. We learned by doing, reciting multiplication tables together, reading aloud from the same battered texts no matter what grade you claimed, and taking turns at the blackboard with stubby bits of chalk, knees almost knocking for fear of a misspelled answer. The order of the day was simple. Lessons in the morning, a bit of arithmetic, a page or two of geography, followed by a round of spelling bees that made nerves flare more than anything else. Recess was the great equalizer, boys and girls set free to run and shout. Games made from little more than skipping rope or a soft rubber ball. The older ones roped into helping the younger across melting snow or jump puddles in spring. Sometimes a sudden rain would keep us inside, pressed too close together for comfort, but nobody complained. There were stories to hear and songs to sing, and Mrs. Ramsey could turn any lull into a lesson about history or the worth of patience. When lunch came, we ate together at our desks, sandwiches cobbled from leftovers and butter scraped thin, sharing bites with those whose families had it harder that week, learning without a word that generosity was as expected as neat handwriting. The afternoons brought a shift, a softening of lessons into craft or sewing. Sometimes time spent tending the little garden out back that was meant to teach both science and self-reliance. The beds planted and weeded by a filing line of small hands. Every so often, someone's parent would visit, a father on leave, a mother with extra pie to share, and the schoolhouse felt almost festive, everyone eager to hear news from elsewhere. The day always ended the same. A bell's sharp ring, books packed away, and a thank you murmured more often than not for the time given, for the chance to learn beneath one roof regardless of age or circumstance. What strikes me now, more than the lessons on any page, was the way we grew together in that one crowded space. We knew how to look out for each other, how to see past age or standing, how to lift the discouraged and celebrate the smallest triumphs. A tough word spelled right, a problem solved at the blackboard after days of struggle, a neighbor's gratitude for help at the well. It was a place where the past and future braided together, where hardships out in the world gave way to moments of discovery and laughter, and where the teacher's steady hand kept us tethered to hope even when news from the radio grew dim. After the last lesson, we'd spill back outside, squinting against the brightness, trooping home with heads full of new facts and hearts a little stronger for the company. Those schoolhouse days taught more than sums and reading. They built the sturdy core of patience, respect, and wisdom that carried so many of us through the hard years and blessed ones that followed. Even now, I see that little room framed in afternoon light and know that, for all it lacked in grandeur, it gave us everything that mattered most. After hours spent poring over arithmetic, spelling lists, and careful lessons in that crowded one-room schoolhouse, recess was the moment that set everyone free. A brief spell each day when the world seemed bigger than the chalk-scrawled walls, and where the worries of home and war faded to the background behind the simple thrill of play. Out we'd go, pails and books dropped in a hurry, boots clattering across the porch as we burst into the yard, faces flush with the joy that can only come when rules are momentarily left behind and laughter becomes the order of the hour. The schoolyard was no great expanse, mostly a dust map of grass worn thin by generations before, some patches muddy after rain, a few stubborn weeds poking through the edges where the girls might gather to braid clover into rings or argue about jump rope rhythm. The center of the yard, though, always belonged to the games with a ball, a battered rubber thing, scuffed from years of use, finding a fresh life with each new match called out by whoever claimed it first. Older children marked out boundaries with their feet, sticks, or, in winter, lines scratched into frost, while the youngest hovered nearby, eager for a chance, but just learning the ropes. We played whatever the season allowed, kickball in the spring, dodgeball at the edge of autumn, simple catch through the stretch of long summer days until the bell called us back inside. Teams weren't chosen with fuss. You jumped in where you fit, a friend's hand pulling you out of shyness or a neighbor giving advice on how best to aim a kick so the ball rolled far enough for a run. There was cheering, sometimes teasing, but never meanness. The ball was passed from child to child, boots flying, laughter building, the chatter of safe and out, mixing with the shouts of encouragement. Some days, a teacher joined in, hem pulled up and eyes sparkling, her calm presence making the misses and fumbles easier to bear. Victory didn't mean much except a chance to laugh a little longer, a story to bring home about a wild catch or a clever dodge, sometimes a boast to siblings in the evenings. Loss washed away with the next round of play, nobody keeping track beyond what could be remembered till the next day. Once in a while, a ball would soar over the fence, caught, maybe, in a bramble or lost in a rain puddle, and all hands would go searching, tiny fingers pulling at branches. The group banded together until it turned up. No one ever gave up until that ball was found, proof that effort and teamwork outlast the setbacks every time. For some, these games became the heart of school, a clue to who you'd walk home with, who'd help you up after a tumble, who would sneak you a turn at first kick or chase down the ball when it got lost beneath a bench. Teachers watched from the steps, keeping a gentle eye, sometimes refereeing disputes that faded as quickly as they began. In winter, we played slow, breath freezing in the air, mittens flying off and faces red from the cold, the ball bouncing awkward off ice, but always enough to spark joy and movement. Recess with a ball was more than just exercise. It was a daily lesson in belonging, in finding simple happiness that no lesson plan could teach, in knowing that the world, with all its demands and dividing lines, still made time for every child to take a shot, run with friends, and laugh without fear. Looking back, those games didn't mark skill or winning as much as they marked closeness. The way play knits together children from every home, builds bridges between grade levels, and turns even ordinary school yards into kingdoms of light-hearted friendship for a little while. As the bell rang and we trudged back inside, faces still bright, the energy from the yard lingered, carried through the rest of our lessons, and on into afternoon chores and nighttime dreams. That old ball, scraped and battered, was a bit of everyday magic, and the games we played on the dust and the grass are some of the surest memories I have, proof that, even in hard years, joy was a gift that kept returning, round after round, day by day. Evenings in our old house started slow once the busy shouts and scuffles of play drifted out of the yard. Chores found their finish, and supper faded into quiet, but there was always still work to be done, especially if you were a schoolchild in those years. While radio programs murmured in another room and parents folded laundry, we'd gather at the sturdy wooden table set near the west-facing window, and once the sunlight dropped below the trees, the kerosene lamp would be lit. The act was its own little ceremony. My mother would check the wick, twist the knob until the flame rose steady, and shield it just right to keep the smoke from curling into the ceiling. That warm circle of lamplight brought comfort, made shadows long, and our pencils seemed to scratch with extra purpose into worn exercise books and scraps of paper saved from week to week. Homework in those days, reading, copying lessons, spelling drills, or arithmetic sums, was no grand operation, but it was approached with a care shaped by scarcity and pride. Pages handed out by Mrs. Ramsey were wrinkled but treasured, often copied for multiple assignments, and every answer was written deliberate, not rushed. Brothers and sisters sat shoulder to shoulder, trading erasers or sharing textbooks, older ones leaning over to help the little ones sound out words, catching mistakes before a stern teacher could. Sometimes father sat with us, minutes after returning from his own hard day, brow furrowed at a tricky math problem or nodding in approval when a paragraph read well. If the rationing had pinched hard and candles were scarce, we'd sit in tight formation, heads almost touching the lamp, careful not to tip or lean too wild. It was easy for tempers to flare, when sums wouldn't line up, when words stuck in the throat, when ink ran thin from being stretched too long. But mostly, calm prevailed, helped along by the yellow, gentle glow and the knowledge that doing your work well mattered, even if nobody ever said it plain. Parents checked progress, sometimes gently, sometimes with a half-joking tease to write straighter, so the teacher won't squint so much. There was no escaping responsibility. Homework was a signal to the household that time for learning stretched past the ring of the school bell into the private, precious hours of the evening. Every so often, the lamp's flame would flicker low, and a parent would rise to tend it, trim the wick, refill kerosene, passing a hand over the glass chimney, as if soothing a cranky child. When a storybook needed reading, one of the older siblings might take charge, voice strong through the looping details, while the rest listened in, eyes tired but eager for the next chapter. Sometimes a slip of laughter ran through the group at a funny illustration or a badly pronounced name. Sometimes, a moment of silence while the youngest puzzled over a tough word, earning a pat on the back as soon as success arrived. Neighbors sometimes dropped by, sets of problems or spelling drills in hand, asking for a borrowed lamp or a bit of help. Our kitchen table, pressed close to the lamp and the scratch of pencils, became a small haven for half the street on rough nights. Outside, the world stayed dark, war news distant in the air, but inside, we traded answers and tips as freely as any pie or cup of flour. By bedtime, homework was finished and pages stacked neatly. The lamp turned low until only a soft, smoky glow remained. We'd carry books back to our bags, feeling a small pride in our effort. The energy spent under lamplight never begrudged, but held like a promise that tomorrow, in the crowded schoolroom, we'd be ready. Lessons learned not just from paper and ink, but from patience, shared struggle, and the gentle, illuminating circle of home. Looking back, I see that work by kerosene lamp not only built skills, but built families, ties drawn tighter in low lamplight, care stitched quietly from the shared ritual of study and perseverance, one evening at a time. Springtime at the one-room schoolhouse brought more than just the promise of milder air and softening ground. It also meant the anticipation of class pictures and graduations, a moment that marked the passage of another year not just in learning, but in growing together. Preparations for class pictures began days in advance, chatter weaving through desks as mothers inched hems, fathers polished shoes, and every child wondered whether they'd smile or frown for the traveling photographer, who always arrived with his wooden tripod and a dusting of tobacco on his collar. The teacher, Mrs. Ramsey, made a point of reminding us to wear our cleanest shirts and brightest courage, smoothing stray hairs and setting rows by hideout beneath the budding oak by the fence, her own nerves hidden under a careful smile. Even the shyest among us felt the weight and the excitement of the moment. For some families, a class picture, the only photograph taken that year, was a treasure to be tucked in the Bible, hung proud above the mantel, or mailed across the country to relatives who'd never met half the faces in the frame. The group would assemble, backs straight as fence posts, squinting against spring sun, arms pressed at sides or folded awkwardly, knowing their best was expected. Teachers and parents fussed over placement, the photographer's gentle instructions, look here, chin up, just like that, and the click and whir that froze us in time. Graduation, too, was more than ceremony. It was reassurance that the lean months and hard years had counted for something big. As the last weeks of school fell away, anticipation buzzed through lessons and song practice. Girls learning to pin ribbons in borrowed dresses, boys warned to scrub their hands and mind their manners. Mrs. Ramsey would rehearse small speeches with the graduates, careful not to show too much emotion, though in private moments she sometimes dabbed at her eyes when the day drew close. The schoolhouse, scrubbed for the occasion, filled with bouquets carried from home gardens, desks pushed back to make room for rows of folding chairs, the walls lined with crepe streamers, and simple homemade banners stitched together by mothers' hands. On graduation day, families crowded the small room, the air thick with pride and nervous excitement, fathers shuffling on work-worn feet, mothers clutching pocket handkerchiefs, siblings restless with anticipation. The names of those passing to the next level were called, applause rising, the teacher shaking hands firmly and offering words that lingered long after the event. Sometimes the oldest student stepped forward to read a poem, or the youngest sang a song. The ease of performance built from many afternoons of practice at home and in class. What set these moments apart was not their grandeur. There were no orchestras, no grand gowns, only modest smiles and trembling pride, but their importance. For many children, graduation meant a first step toward work or further schooling, a brave new chapter begun in the same room where they had first learned letters, numbers, or the meaning of friendship. Class pictures, meanwhile, became records of community, faces pressed together in uncertain sunlight, holding tight to each other for one hopeful instant before time carried them outward to new fields, new towns, or even faraway cities. After the celebration, mothers gathered to gather up leftover pie and paper cups, children whispered about summer plans, and fathers congratulated each other quietly, knowing that perseverance led to these small but mighty victories. Photographs were collected, tucked into envelopes, marked with signatures on the back, evidence of belonging, of having been there, seen and remembered as part of something larger than yourself. Looking back, those class pictures and graduations blur in memory, separable only by the year etched in pencil on the reverse side. Yet the feeling of communal pride and gentle farewell lingers clear and strong. Through war, through worry, through the ordinary struggles of everyday life, these rites of passage allowed young and old alike to pause, reflect, and gather strength for whatever came next, sending each graduate and group forward with hope lit by the softness of spring and the certainty that, even in a modest schoolhouse, beneath thin sunlight, the lessons of togetherness and courage mattered most of all. When the final ring of the schoolhouse bell echoed across the yard and notebooks were snapped shut, the day's lessons slipped instantly to the background as we raced out into the cool air, ready to claim the precious patch of time that belonged only to us, before the obligations of home called us back to task. Those after-school hours carried their own rhythm. dictated not by teachers, but by the insistent needs of a household stretched to meet the war's demands and the familiar rituals of rural living. For many of us, chores were waiting, a list carefully pinned by mothers before breakfast or recited from memory as we tugged on coats and waved a last goodbye over our shoulder. There was a certain comfort and order in those routines. Each of us had tasks suited to our age and strength. The youngest might gather eggs from nervous hens, hands sticky with straw, while the older ones headed for the woodpile, splitting logs into manageable pieces with an awkward swing inherited from fathers and brothers before us. Some were sent to patch gaps in the garden fence or clear stones from the path, others to refill water buckets carried balanced against one hip, sloshing heavily with every step. I recall the quiet pride, hard to name at the time, in seeing a neighbor's windows light up as you stacked firewood on their porch, or in the nod of approval when the woodbox beside the stove was filled clean and neat before dark. Errands, especially for those of us old enough to be trusted with coins or ration stamps, offered a window into adult responsibility. A trip to the general store or market was more than just an outing for sweets. You'd carry a list wrinkled in your pocket, each item a small negotiation in the currency of war, sugar and flour only if stamps allowed, canned goods if the shelves weren't already bare. In line, you'd listen to the gentle hum of neighbors trading news and tips for stretching a meal, clerks marking down purchases in careful ledgers, each transaction a lesson in patience, thrift, and perseverance. Sometimes, if luck held, there'd be a special treat, a rare orange, a penny's worth of mixed candy, a bright new pencil for school, snagged as a reward for honesty and prompt returns. On the walk home, the pace slowed with the weight of packages or buckets, friends and siblings matching steps, voices low but content as the day faded and the first lamps flickered on in kitchen windows all along the lane. If a lost dog needed finding, or a message delivering, or a neighbor unwell needed soup carried from one house to the next, the job fell naturally to whichever child's route fit best. No one balked. These small kindnesses, rarely remarked upon but never forgotten, created a quiet, unseen network of reliance and care that ran beneath the louder bustle of grown-up worry and wartime sacrifice. Sometimes, with chores done and supper not yet begun, we would steal a minute to ourselves, throwing a last ball, swinging over the creek on a rope, sitting on the porch steps, and sharing secrets or dreams under the rose and gold of late afternoon. There was no sense yet of chores as burden, no talk of reward beyond a second helping at table or the satisfaction of seeing a task finished with your own hands. Instead, the work was woven seamlessly into the fabric of growing up, a living lesson practiced day after day alongside sums and spelling, a grounding force that built patience and resilience as surely as any formal instruction. Looking back, I know that those hours, marked by muddy boots, aching arms, laughter, and the gentle creaks and clatter of a well-run home, were an education all their own. They taught us the worth of effort, the peace found in shared work, and the way small deeds multiplied until the whole community gleamed with quiet industriousness. By the time lamps threw golden light across supper tables, chores finished and hands washed, we'd gathered more than just eggs and kindling, flour and news. We'd gathered proof, undeniable and lasting, that even in hard times, a little effort from many hands could make any world feel whole. Evenings in our house often carried a rare current of anticipation when we heard the postman's steps on the walk, the soft rattle of envelopes against the wooden box just as supper settled and the last chores unwound. Letters from the front were more than simple correspondence. They were lifelines stretched across continents and oceans, threading love, anxiety, and hope from those who had gone to serve back into the fabric of daily life for those who waited. The whole household grew still as a slip of familiar handwriting was spotted, recognition passing from hand to hand with careful reverence, sometimes a hesitant wonder if this time the news would be good. On the nights a letter did arrive, we'd gather around the kitchen table, faces shining with relief or nerves, the envelope opened with deliberate slowness to savor every second before its contents spilled out. The writing inside, a careful script, always a little neater than usual, carried news both momentous and mundane. Lines about weather in strange countries, daily routines in camps or on ships, fleeting descriptions of far-off cities and landscapes so different from anything we'd known. There'd be reassurances that rations were manageable, that friendships formed among the ranks, that hope was held on to with a stubborn, necessary grip. Sometimes a small drawn map or pressed wildflower accompanied the words, tiny tokens of the places loved ones now called home, at least for a little while. But the letters never hid the hardness. They spoke in gentle code about nights interrupted by alarms, of friends injured and lost, of homesickness that ached deeper than cold. They asked again and again for news. How was the garden? Did the hens lay? Did the youngest finally lose her wobbly tooth? Did the family keep faith as bravely as the soldiers must do daily? That longing for normal, for connection, was as clear as anything in ink. Each reply from home an answer to loneliness and a shield against fear, each detail from the front a branch connecting distant lives. After the reading, the letter would be passed around for everyone to touch, children careful not to smudge, grandparents squinting at the smaller script. Sometimes tears glistened in the lamplight, silent but unashamed, mingling grief with joy at simply knowing the sender was safe enough to write. We'd draft replies with just as much care, pressing news and bits of daily sunshine into the paper. Descriptions of newly planted rows in the garden, the success of a neighbor's pie, or the first apple blossom on the ancient tree by the back fence. Every word was a promise that life at home carried on, that memory and love remained steadfast, and that laughter, no matter how brittle, still found a place at the table. Neighbors shared in the ritual too, on days when no letter came. Hopeful questions were exchanged at the gate and at Sunday service. Words of encouragement traded among families holding their own vigil. Some letters read aloud became communal property. News of a nearby son passed room to room, a comfort equally for those waiting and those remembering their own gone too soon. Saving the letters was an act of both habit and hope. Drawers filled up, tied with ribbon or stored in biscuit tins, the pages reread on evenings when nerves frayed or courage flagged, serving as reminders of endurance, love, and the unbreakable will to continue. These missives, patched with news and longing, were the invisible threads that helped families hold together, stronger than ration books, sharper than the headlines, a presence in the house as real as any memory or dream. Looking back, those letters stand as the quiet backbone of the era, a testament to words carried over distance and time, a lamp in the dark and a steady hand for the heart's most difficult burdens. They marked our days with the hope that one day, sender and receiver would be together again, free at last to speak the words which, for so long, only ink and paper had borne between them. In the fading light of long school days, with lessons finished and playground games abandoned for the slapping of lunch pails against knees, the one-room schoolhouse became a hive for whispers, a chorus of eager, anxious, and sometimes wildly misinformed voices determined to piece together the world outside, especially when the war pressed its shadow closer from all sides. Schoolyard rumors found fertile ground in the gaps left by ration newspapers and fragments overheard from adults, sending stories spinning in circles of laughter, worry, and hope. It often started with the arrival of a parent at pickup, their tight-lipped greeting or excited wave setting off speculation before anyone could ask a direct question. "Did you hear about the battleship?" a child would declare, having listened in on grown-up talk after dinner, his voice full of certainty even if the details were shaky. Others piped up, stories of soldiers coming home or not, of new towns bombed or villages saved, each tale changing slightly every time it was retold, names morphing, places shifting, the web of rumor growing thick and sometimes tangled in the sharp air of anticipation that marked the time. There were days when the teacher tried to set things right. Mrs. Ramsey, with patience and careful words, would explain what was known, separating fact from fiction with the same calm she applied to a tough grammar lesson, and reminding us not to let worry take root from stories that couldn't be checked. Still, something stuck. Did the president really visit someone's cousin's town? Were the boys at camp sending secret gifts home next week? Was there truth in the hush-hush about ration books being doubled before Christmas? Kids built worlds from these rumors, fueling games and secret plans, sometimes even comforting each other when doubt crept in. Not every rumor was about war or hardship. Some were brighter, dreams of parades when peace came, wild hopes about the return of older brothers for graduation, even tales of heroics from local folk woven in with as much pride as imagination. These became living stories, shared in hopscotch lines and beneath oak trees, bits of hope stitched together in spite of downcast headlines and adult worries. Occasionally, news from the outside would make its way into the classroom in the form of a flyer, a visiting speaker, or a real letter read aloud. Those moments slowed every heart and drew all eyes, feeding hungry minds with something more reliable than rumor, but still colored by longing. The war was everywhere in those years, on the lips of fathers, in the worried glances of mothers, in the games we played at recess where some boys marched in line and others pretended to be aviators carving heroics from ordinary flight. Yet, even as rumors ran wild, there existed an understanding that not everything could be believed right away. Older children, entrusted with more chores and more knowledge, learned to temper the stories, to gently correct without crushing. Teachers and parents tried to foster discernment, teaching not only arithmetic and spelling, but also how to weigh what was heard against what was known, an education in patience and careful listening that lasted long after the war itself faded into history. Looking back, the swirl of rumors and news wasn't just a distraction. It was part of growing up in uncertain times. Gossip, true and false, threaded our small town's hopes and worries together, making sense of a world half-filtered through static-laden radios and hurried conversations. The schoolyard, with its blend of fable, hope, and caution, became a training ground for resilience, curiosity, and the stubborn optimism needed to hang on through nights marked by news bulletins and days brightened by the whisper that peace, somehow, somewhere, was surely on the way. In the first blue light before dawn, the old house stirred to life. Its walls knew every pattern. Boots thumping over planked floors, kettle rattling for water on the stove, a snatch of song from father as he shrugged on his work coat. The rhythms of the day unfolded not just from a sense of necessity, but out of the steady hope that marked those years, each morning a small act of resilience in a world shadowed by war and want. Awake before the sun, I took in that hush quietly, listening to my own mother hum as she fetched the coffee tin, careful not to use too much in the percolator, saving back what she could for Sundays or the days when a neighbor might drop by. Our kitchen held 1,000 memories, but most precious were the ones built from ordinary mornings, where the warmth of routine patched up the cold realities found just beyond the kitchen door. Breakfasts were simple in those days, shaped by what the ration book allowed and the luck found at market the day before. Cornmeal mush thickened with a spoon of molasses if the month was kind, biscuits cut small so they'd go farther, eggs only when the hens obliged despite storms rattling the coop. Still, there was pride in sharing what we had, passing plates across wood scarred by years of elbows and laughter. Father'd read a bit from the paper while Mother set the table. War news first, followed often as not by local births, victories in the garden, or notices for church suppers and scrap drives. Each headline a measure of distance between survival and comfort, the weight of the world tucked in between stories of neighbors and kin. After breakfast, the house buzzed with the preparations for work and school. My siblings tumbled out of the bedrooms, inspecting patched knees, hunting for missing socks, grumbling about lessons just as much as about chores. Grandmother called from her back room, asking for a hand with her knitting or to set the laundry to soak. Outside, the light grew, and the world seemed less frightening with chores begun, the routine a shield of sorts. Every broom sweep and boot lace another link in an unspoken chain. My father left quietly, not much for goodbyes, off to the factory that swallowed men and women day after day, its whistle a constant companion to the sunrise. I'd walk him as far as the gate some days. Those mornings were rare, but in them, the quiet love woven through our house felt strongest. When the front door shut and the day spread before us, school lessons became the next great anchor. In truth, I never cared much for arithmetic, but Mrs. Ramsey's calm patience, and the competition with my brother, made it bearable. We packed our books and started for the schoolhouse, shoes crunching over gravel, lunch pails swinging with the confidence of routine. The path was familiar, the neighbors' greetings steady, and the sky overhead, whether clear or full of racing clouds, framed our journey with the touchstone logic that life, for all its chaos, went on. In the one-room schoolhouse, learning and growing happened together. Grades mixed as freely as the chatter during recess. Lessons ranged from spelling drills recited in slow, careful voices to the quiet practice of penmanship, the scrape of nibs against thin, reused papers, and music all its own. Mrs. Ramsey shepherded her flock with discipline and kindness, moving through the ranks with a gentle hand and sharp eye, correcting mistakes, encouraging effort, and teaching us, through her example, the worth of persistence. School days were built on repetition, the daily grind of sums and sentences, the weekly recitations, the trust that tomorrow's lesson would be just a bit more challenging, and each success was celebrated quietly, marked despite the limitations of what supplies and patience the year afforded. Recess was our reward, the chance to run, laugh, and forget for a while the pressure of multiplication tables or a botched dictation. Games with a battered ball filled the yard with noise, booted feet and shouts echoing beneath the pale sun. Victory meant little, but the ease of friendship and quick forgiveness for missteps meant everything. Teachers joined in sometimes, and the games blurred the lines between adult and child, between learning and living. Each tumble in the grass or scramble for a loose ball stitched us together tighter, and even arguments, brief as a gust of wind, dissolved before the return to desks and chalk dust. Afternoons moved slower in the schoolhouse, lessons yielding to crafts, stories, and garden plots tended at the building's edge. The oldest students explained the value of crop rotation to the youngest, their faces creasing with pride at being allowed the authority. Sometimes a parent visited, bringing news or treats, and the room felt brighter, suddenly infused with adult importance and affirmation. At day's end, the scramble for home began again, boots flying, papers rustling, the sun lower and the world no less hopeful for the effort given over hours of careful learning. Home, in the late afternoon, meant chores. No one escaped them, and while complaining was permitted, ignoring work was not. Eggs gathered, wood stacked, water drawn, laundry sorted and pegged to dry. Each task paired with its own lesson, its own moment of frustration or triumph. I remember my mother's voice, gentle when it needed to be, firm when the work lagged, a steady guide through the uneven geography of daily obligation. The work built muscles, sure, but it also built character, patience, and a sense that every hand in the family mattered for the house to run steady. Errands into town, a trip for flour, a swap of ration stamps, a careful negotiation for sugar, gifted us glimpses of a wider world. In the store, the talk wound around shortages, shared recipes, news from the front carried by whispers and flyers posted crooked above the cash counter. Clerks and customers traded smiles with the solemnity of folks determined to keep spirits up, and children found delight in small purchases. A sweet, a pencil, a bright bolt of thread, each gift a beacon for later. The walk home with arms full was a ritual in gratitude and responsibility, the shops closing behind us as the day's work fell softly toward its close. Evenings settled in quietly. Homework, undertaken at the kitchen table, found its light in the warm glow of the kerosene lamp. Everyone gathered for a stretch of study beneath its circle. Siblings traded erasers, advice, and stories, the night's silence broken only by the gentle encouragement of parents, the murmur of corrections, and the sighs of frustration that marked the process of learning. Sometimes, lessons were easy, pages filled, sums lined up without trouble, but more often there was struggle, mistakes made, corrections offered and accepted, a practice in humility and resilience that carried over far outside the walls of home and school. When the lamp flickered low, the real treasures of the evening emerged, music and letters. Records spun gently on the Victrola, Bing Crosby's croon rising over the hush, smoothing sharp edges and lending a sense of comfort that held the room together. My mother hummed along as she worked. My father leaned back, eyes closed, soaking in the balm of familiar melody. It was no grand performance, but it felt like one in the smallness of the room, the fire's glow and steady beat marking time and healing worry. Letters, when they came, turned the night electric. The arrival of a slip of paper from a brother, cousin, neighbor at the front sent a surge of hope through everyone present. Opening the envelope was a group act, fingers careful not to tear, eyes hungry for every line of news. The words carried laughter, longing, assurance, and fear. They reassured with stories of small joys, good weather, new friendships, decent food, while never hiding the ache of loneliness and risk. Replies were drafted with just as much care, news pressed into pages with hope that comfort might travel swiftly, connecting lives torn apart with the silent strength of written words. As sleep approached, the household found its rituals, beds made, songs sung soft, the youngest tucked in with whispered prayers for safety and peace. Outside, the news lingered in the air, rumors that spread between schoolyard and kitchen table, stories half true but carried with a stubborn hope that peace would return, that hardship would ease, that those away would come safely home. Sometimes, neighbors stopped by, traded pie for news, laughter for reassurance, their presence a reminder that the ties of community, woven in work, shared meals, mutual concern, were as necessary as any lesson or meal. Weekends shifted the pace, bringing both joy and exhaustion. Saturday meant market day, cleaning, sometimes a matinee at the old theater, dreams played out in silver light as the world outside pressed in close. Newsreels brought the war near, heroes real and imagined, victories celebrated before the escapism of adventure stories or comedies. The theater was a sanctuary, crowded yet intimate, a space where laughter and fear mingled before everyone spilled back out into the known streets. Sunday was for rest and reckoning. Mornings formed around church bells and quiet prayers, the washing up and donning of best clothes performed with gravity and gratitude. Services joined the town's hopes together, voices united in hymns, whispered intentions for safety and relief. Afterward, families gathered for meals made larger by company, stories traded over roast and potatoes, pie layered with laughter and the gentle correction of memory. The day's slow unfolding allowed both healing and planning. Letters written, pictures taken, habits passed down and solidified for the week already forming just over the horizon. The wider world, for all its uncertainty, was always present. Radio voices spoke on heroics, losses, inventions, and politics. The block hummed with scrap metal drives and knitting circles, neighbors banding together to stretch resources and make the world safer in whatever ways they could. Children learned, through rumor and example, how to discern truth from fiction, how to ask questions without fear, how to see possibility in even the smallest acts of kindness. School years advanced, class pictures snapped in the yard, graduations celebrated with modest pride. Every milestone was a gift to parents, teachers, and children alike, each event a reminder of struggle overcome and growth achieved. The rituals were homegrown, ribbons borrowed, poems recited, chairs filled by neighbors bearing gifts of pie and well-wishing. The simplest snapshots and signatures became treasures, reminders that, for all the lean times and lingering fears, community and connection were the real rewards. When spring arrived, the cycle began anew. Gardens seeded, chores taken up with fresh resolve, school lessons harder, ambitions greater. The wheel of seasons spun, each day a thread in the tapestry of hope, perseverance, and simple pleasure that marked life in those years. The world watched nervously, every rumor and headline weighing on the small town's heart. But inside each home, the steady routines and gentle rituals built resilience sharper than any shadow outside. Looking back, it's not just the events or the news that linger. It's the steady work, shared joys, collective heartbreak, and patient hope woven through every hour. The sound of the kettle, the taste of a rare sweet, the feel of a child's hand in yours, the laughter around tables broken by loss, but rebuilt with love. These, more than anything, are the legacy of our hardest years. Every life was changed, but every heart was strengthened, and the stories we built, quiet, humble, defiant, stand as proof that even in lean times, grace can grow, light can fill a home, and the ordinary can become extraordinary. The morning's light drifted through thin curtains, pale and cold, promising little warmth for those in our house rising to face another day set against the threadbare edges of wartime living. Each dawn began the same, with familiar sounds and modest hopes gathered around the kitchen table. Steam curling from a chipped mug and the scrape of spoons against bowls revealed a home made sturdy by habit and memory. Our old clock ticked steadily, and outside, the world roused itself with the blunt certainty of necessity. Neighbors visible through frost-blurred windows wiping their spectacles, bending to examine stubborn garden beds, kicking at stoop ice, and glancing up for any signs the weather might be shifting. The war shaped everything, from meals planned in whispers, fingers tracing ration coupons, to the simple comfort of fresh-baked bread cut thin so it might last till the week's last supper. Father's boots scraped on the floor, always the sign the day would truly begin. He'd check his wristwatch, button his coat, and pull on his hat as if steeling himself against not just the chill but the weight of news and rumors. A word to mother, often unspoken but felt, a squeeze of her arm at the stove, a shared glance too brief for the children to catch. No one wasted time with sentiment, not in those years, but love thrived in small gestures, quiet reassurances pressed into the grain of daily labor. Grandmother, frail and quick to instruct, would bustle with the casseroles and jars set for storage. Her world's rules formed before the first lines of rationing but adapted with relentless ingenuity. Her hands, gentle but decisive, saved peels for broth, reused tea leaves for a second pot. A lifetime of making do distilled to the essence of wartime persistence. Old stories lingered in every room, tales of prosperity and heartbreak. The laughter of absent kin never entirely faded from the corners where children played. Even now, with losses accumulating in far-off lands, and every headline a fresh reason for worry, the house remained its own steady universe. In the early hours, after the men had departed for the plant, women set to work mending, scrubbing, and tending the garden rows with sleeves rolled, boots worn ragged, and songs hummed soft. Morning chores demanded more than muscle. They needed resolve, a willingness to stretch what little remained, and a stubborn refusal to let hardship claim even those moments set aside for joy. In those acts, tradition and sacrifice braided tightly together. School for me and my siblings was a walk through slush or dust, shoes tugged snug, lunch pails rattling with their handful of biscuits, cheese, and apple if fortune smiled. The one-room schoolhouse stood square to the street, its walls weather-beaten but proud. At the door, Mrs. Ramsey greeted every child with a nod or a kind word, her face etched with care and humor, features softened by years of seeing children through trembling letters and hesitant sums. She believed in repetition and reason, but she also believed in laughter and kindness, cultivating in us not just the knowledge scraped from battered textbooks, but a sense that learning was an armor as much as a privilege. Lessons marched on with the measured cadence of chalk and recitation, clusters of students grouped by skill rather than age. When one flinched under a difficult arithmetic problem, the others rallied, whispering hints, sharing solutions, the bonds of peer respect as vital as any teacher's patience. Schoolyards in autumn filled with ball games played to exhaustion, the scuffed rubber orb tracing the arc of freedom across packed earth and icy puddles. If the game's rules broke down, if the teams grew lopsided or a ball curved wild into the neighbor's garden, no harm lingered, only the quick breath of forgiveness and the promise to try again tomorrow. Cold days brought all inside, thick with steam from lunches unpacked and stifled energy bursting into song and game at the teacher's gentle urging. The space shrank, but spirits stretched, and even shy children found their voices. When the bell called us home, lessons were stowed, hats pulled low, and the chatter of small victories warmed the walk back. Sometimes a neighbor's dog tagged along, muddying boots, welcomed as another soul to share in the ordinary resilience of youth. Afternoons set children to chores, little ones tasked with gathering kindling, older siblings splitting logs, stacking coal, patching fences, hunting errant hens. Every job mattered, and every child was counted on. Though we complained and made mischief, the lessons of responsibility inseparable from the pleasure of fleeting rest when the work was through. We grew strong on chores and learned the quiet language of encouragement, the pride in a cleanly swept yard, the satisfaction of laundry hung without a crease, the respect earned by diligence and trust. Errands were a world apart. A visit to the grocer meant grown-up tasks and grown-up conversation, ration books clutched in trembling hands, each stamp set against hope. The clerk at the counter, old Mr. Harper, his spectacles thick and voice always gentle, underscored the gravity of every purchase. A pound of flour, half a stick of butter, a handful of penny candies offered with a wink to children who'd waited at the edge of the crowd. Families learned to trade not just goods but recipes, news, and concern, the shop a gathering place for rumor and reassurance. Every transaction knit with the greater fabric of shared struggle. The walk home from town was slow and measured, arms full of supplies, pockets sometimes light, but spirits bolstered by chance encounters and fresh resolve. With spring's arrival, this route sparkled with buds and the promise of gardens. New hope stitched to the memory of last year's lean months and the faith that soil would yield, hens would lay, and hard days would not outlast the ties of kin and friendship. Evenings at home began with homework, pages of sums, passages to copy, spelling words labored over with furrowed brow and whispered encouragement. The kerosene lamp cast a warm, reliable glow, its circle binding us together in quiet focus. Mistakes were unraveled with patience, answers corrected, older siblings offering insight, younger ones trembling at the prospect of tomorrow's lesson. Later, when studies were finished, books tucked away and the lamp turned low, we shifted from learning to creation, songs sung, stories told, sometimes a poem read aloud by grandmother, her voice trembling but intent, each line sinking deep and taking root in hearts not yet hardened by the world's demands. Rituals continued in music. The Victrola spun records as mother hummed, father dozed, and the youngest tried their best at harmonies. Bing Crosby's voice coated the stretch of the room in comfort, smoothing over nerves and lending the air a sense of uncomplicated possibility. Old favorites mingled with fresh joys, and nights turned softer for the ordinary company of melody, ballads given and received in the gentle hush of family and home. Those rare evenings when a letter arrived were events of ceremony and shared anticipation. The envelope was passed reverently, opened slow, its words read aloud and absorbed. News of distant lands, soldier sons and uncles describing hardship and hope. Small encouragements sent back from the thin edge between survival and longing. Tears were shed quietly, gratitude pressed into every new reply, the act of writing itself an anchor against uncertainty. In quieter moments, replies grew into miniature histories, descriptions of the garden's progress, stories of neighbors' kindness, promises made and kept in the small hours before sleep. Weekends, punctuated by the rituals of rest and play, brought the family together for outings, reflection, and celebration. A trip to the movie theater meant a break from the rigors of daily labor. Seats squeezed close, popcorn rationed, the darkest sanctuary of laughter and marvel as newsreels flickered across the screen and heroes blazed through peril and joy. The theater, sanctuary, and community in equal measure collected everyone's hope, anxiety, and fleeting happiness, stitching a patchwork of memory and anticipation. Sundays radiated a special gentleness. Early church, old hymns, prayers rising like smoke through the old rafters, each act restoring a sense of belonging and purpose. Families gathered anew alongside old friends and newcomers, sharing meals, stories, plans for the week, and reflective words about what mattered most. In spring, the tables burst with color, pies set out in pride, laughter echoing from room to room, the faint ache of loss softened by shared comfort and renewed optimism. Throughout, the pulse of the neighborhood never relented. Scrap metal drives rumbled through the block, wagons loaded and laughter traded between piles of old pots, old hopes, all gathered for the distant promise of victory. Knitting circles made socks and scarves, hands busy, mouths trading gossip and encouragement. The sense of togetherness counteracted weariness. We learned by example that effort, however small, held meaning far beyond our front doors. School advanced, and every year, the class picture and graduation served as touchstones, records of patience, progress, and perseverance. The photographer arrived with his wooden tripod, students dressed in best shirts, sometimes borrowed, sometimes painstakingly mended, assembled in the bright yard for a moment of communal pride. Graduation crowned the year, confirmation for children and parents alike that hope, work, and kindness stretched beyond hardship and into the future with quiet certainty. Spring thickened, gardens blossomed, and the world seemed briefly less threatening. Even as news from the front persisted in radio bulletins and hushed kitchen conversation. The block moved in cycles, seeds sown, chores completed, errands run, surprises traded in moments of serendipity, a neighbor's pie, a letter from afar, the success of a long-tended plant. Children ran wild in the lengthening afternoons, their laughter persistent, defiant. Rumors still swirled. War news drifted from schoolyard to supper table and back. Fierce hopes and sharp anxieties braided together in the talk and the plans that shaped the next day's tasks. As dusk arrived, lamps were lit, chores wound down, evening meals thick with gratitude and gentle admonition. Each spoonful and every word marked the day, a testimony to endurance, resilience, and the soft grace of gathering together. Later, in firelit quiet, the work of the day ceded to dreams, to wishes spoken and unspoken, to the steady heartbeat of a home, a community, a world striving always to be better tomorrow. Looking through those days from the safe vantage of memory, I see more than the sum of small routines or anxious hopes. I see evidence, persistent, relentless, and deeply woven, of how people can hold together under hardship, finding solace in company and purpose in daily ritual. Even in the year's leanest quarters, grace found us in music, in meals, in letters and laughter, and the steady discipline of care. War colored everything but failed to conquer the beauty and strength drawn from every shared task, kind word, and enduring hope. Such is how we lived. Week by week, season by season, a tapestry of will and gentleness, stitched from the raw stuff of ordinary courage and abundant faith that the coming light would always be brighter, tomorrow kinder, and each heart stronger for all it had carried and given. In these ways, our story continues, measured not only by the shadows, but by the invincible, everyday light we summoned and shared, one voice, one family, one day at a time.